Chapter 931. The old Taoist, who had a hole in his lower abdomen, and great horns, who had a large dent in his forehead, stared at each other. After a quarter of an hour, both of them shook their bodies at the same time. A strange fragrance spread out, and their injuries were healed at the same time. Not only that, but their energy essence was completely replenished, making them look exactly the same as before they were injured. After glaring at each other for a while, Great Horns shook the spear in his hand and said dryly, "Get out of here and don't bother me." The old Taoist pondered for a moment, then lowered his voice and said softly, "Great Horns, why don't you let Green Emperor, White Emperor, and Black Emperor cultivate here? As long as they don't leave this origin tree of fire, I won't pursue what happened today." Great Horns rolled his eyes, then thrust the spear at the Taoist again. This spear strike was completely different from the previous one. This time, when the spear pierced out, the surrounding void suddenly turned dark red, and the temperature in the void skyrocketed. The twisting heat waves melted the void into a swaying shadow, and the long-browed Taoist was trapped in that small shadow. With a gentle thrust of the spear, the illusory figure was broken. Then, a loud pop was heard, and that part of the void was completely annihilated. Only the long-browed Taoist priest, who was sitting on the cattail hassock, had an ugly expression on his face. He was hovering in the middle of a seemingly small, but in fact, extremely large and empty void. Rings of green light spread out from his body, and wherever they passed, the space, time, air, heat flow, and other things that had disappeared were restored. In the blink of an eye, everything was restored to its original state. "Great Horns, do you have to make things difficult for us?" the Taoist snapped. Great Horns spat a thick phlegm on the ground. It was a clump of purple-black magma, and as soon as the raging flame touched the ocean of magma, it burned the magma within a few miles into a wisp of green smoke that drifted away in the air. It showed how terrifyingly hot his phlegm was. Holding the spear in his hand, he said dryly, "Of course, you are the one who came to me." Twisting his neck, the horn on his head spewed out a great plume of purple flame as he cried out coldly, "Let's fight. If you can take Emperor Qing and the others away, I won't interfere in this matter. If you can't, just get lost. Oh, leave behind the pond of extract flame essence you found in the primordial world 3,000 years ago, the rejuvenating pill you refined 2,700 years ago, and the female disciple with the innate fire divine veins 500 years ago." After tilting his head and pondering for a while, Great Horns went on, "Leave that wine horn of yours, which can produce a corner of jade nectar every day. You Taoists and monks are outrageous. You have set so many rules for your disciples and disciples, but what's the point of eating meat and drinking wine in your cave abodes? Lao Tzu can't live without wine. It's only right that you give me this wine horn." The long-browed Taoist gritted his teeth and said angrily, "Big Horns, are you a robber? You." Great Horns arched his brows and said carelessly, "Which robber is better than me? TSK, since you want to take Emperor Qing and the others from me, I'll take the treasure I want from you. You're not the only one who can rob me, are you?" The old Taoist's face turned blue with anger. Grinning coldly, he waved the golden scepter, sending out two beams of light, one dragon and one tiger, toward Great Horns. "Very well," he said through clenched teeth. "I'd like to see how much you have improved after so many years." Carefully, Wu Qi poked out a wisp of divine sense mixed with the boundless flame from the ground, peeking at the fight between the two supreme existences of Tao fusing realm. In his previous life, Wu Qi was only one step away from the realm of Tao fusing, and he had almost touched the edge of that realm. It was a pity that he was killed by two people at the same time. In this life, he must fuse himself with the Tao and see what it was like. The beams of light of the dragon and the tiger flew toward Great Horns, but he was too lazy to pay any attention to them. Grabbing the spear, he roared and thrust it toward the Taoist's forehead. A loud boom rang out as the beams of light slammed into Great Horns's body, leaving two huge holes in it. But, the spear had also reached the Taoist's forehead. An exotic fragrance wafted through the air, and Great Horns's broken body recovered as if he had never been injured. The Taoist snorted coldly and pointed the jade scepter in his hand forward. All of a sudden, a dazzling ball of flame burst out of Greathorn's spear, and the sharp spear turned into a tree branch, its crimson tip erupting with a great deal of flame. With just a point, the old Taoist had restored Greathorn's spear to its original form, a branch cut off from the origin tree of fire. Laughing, Greathorns grabbed the branch, which suddenly exploded and turned into dozens of spear shadows identical to the spear just now, shooting across the sky and drawing out a dense net of fire in the air. The silhouettes of a dragon and a tiger rushed down toward him again, but the fiery net rolled inward and trapped them. Then, a stream of purple flame sprayed out of Greathorn's mouth, burning the silhouettes into a sheet of golden light and dispersing them. The dragon and tiger Rui held in priest's long eyebrows hands suddenly turned into countless golden, sparkling, rare materials, and over 10 spirit beads that had been releasing the chaos power rose into the sky, seeming to transform into dazzling beams of light and fly away. The old Taoist snorted coldly. With a flick of his left sleeve, all the broken materials were rolled up into his sleeve. Then, he made a grabbing gesture with his right hand, and 3 large hands shrouded in purple mist quickly grabbed toward Green Emperor, White Emperor, and Black Emperor. A plume of green mist rushed out from the top of the Taoist's head, and 3 Taoists with long eyebrows and white beards, who looked exactly like him, flew out, laughing. "Don't panic, fellow Taoist. My senior and junior brothers will help you capture this fiend." The 3 old Taoists, one holding a carrying pole, one a fishing drum, and one a pair of swords, were laughing as they struck down at Greathorns. The void was turned into chaos when the carrying pole struck, the fishing drum shattered the souls of gods, ghosts, and the swords sliced everything in half. As soon as the 3 old Taoists joined the battle, Greathorns was in a sorry state. He was struck 7 times in a row by the carrying pole, his legs were broken and his tendons torn, and the sound of the fishing drum shook him to the core. The 2 swords never left Greathorns' neck, nearly severing his huge head several times. Even though he was a Tao fusing expert, if his head was chopped off, his vitality would be severely damaged, and he would need to stay in bed for recuperation to recover. The 3 large hands shrouded in purple mist had already grabbed the heads of the 3 emperors, and it looked like they were about to capture them alive. Standing on the tree, the lion man flapped his wings and swooped down, slashing the 3 hands into purple mist and dispersing them with his sword. "Long-browed Daozu, it's not fair to fight 4 against 1, he snapped. The Taoist gave a surprised look at the lion man who had shattered the innate grappling hand he had conjured with his energy. He sneered and said, "So, it's the little kitten Greathorns picked up from the chaos years ago. I can't believe you have the cultivation base you have today. Not bad." He laughed and said coldly, "The 3 pure ones is my unique divine ability. If you think it's unfair, why don't you help your master?" Without waiting for the lion man to answer, Greathorns roared, "What are you waiting for? This old ox is ganging up on me. Let's kill him together." While the old Taoist was still in a daze, a huge, pitch-black seal came whistling down from above and hit the Taoist who was holding the shoulder pole. Thousands of lotus flowers bloomed on top of the Taoist's head, and he staggered down, almost falling into the lava. Diagonally, a Taiji scroll composed entirely of chaotic energy flew out. The Taoist priest with the drum in his hand was shaken by the scroll, and was immediately drawn into the small world in the scroll. Vaguely, a celestial being clad in a long robe and wielding a great axe could be seen in the scroll, hacking down at the Taoist. Following a few tinkling noises, a small and exquisite golden bell silently appeared above the head of the Taoist with the twin swords. Before the Taoist could swing his swords to attack, the golden bell swayed and cracked the void. The golden bell released a strong beam of light and smashed onto the Taoist's body, knocking him into the shattered void. Both the Taoist and the bell were sent to somewhere unknown. Then, 3 figures quietly emerged from the magma, and together with Greathorns, who was covered in wounds, they surrounded the Taoist. The expression on the Taoist's face changed dramatically. Gritting his teeth, he glanced at the 3 men and said angrily, "Wu Divinity, Duke Changmu, and Yao Ling, are you determined to make things difficult for us?" Wu Divinity was a pale-faced, frail-looking youth. Duke Changmu was a tall and strong old man with a benevolent face and a strong aura of life. Yao Ling was a stunning young girl dressed in a long black dress that was more than 100 miles long and embroidered with countless exotic flowers and plants of the world. Together with Great Horns, who was tall and shrouded in flames, the four almighty experts of Tao fusing realm had surrounded the Taoist. Together with those who had just swept away the Taoist's 3 clones, there were a total of 7 almighty experts of Tao fusing realm attacking the Taoist. The Taoist's expression was very interesting. He looked like a pervert who had sneaked into a beautiful woman's boudoir, only to find that there were more than 100 burly men with sexual orientation standing in the room after turning on the lights. It was an indescribable excitement, so much so that his face turned as green as a cucumber. Wu Divinity, Duke Changmu, and Yao Ling just smiled and ignored the Taoist. Great Horns, on the other hand, widened his eyes and snorted coldly. What do you mean by making things difficult for us? Lao Tzu and the others are waiting here for the unlucky ones to come knocking on our door. No matter who came today, they wouldn't be able to escape a beating. Lao Tzu has always said that you cowards and bald donkeys need a good beating, so that you can learn your lesson. Laughing strangely, Great Horns said triumphantly, 7 bald donkeys are blocking the gate of the Wahuang clan. Hee, we've also prepared 7 people to beat you. Anyway, we're bullying you with numbers. The 7 of us will beat you up. Since we can't kill you, we'll beat you to our heart's content. The Taoist's mouth twitched with anger. Gritting his teeth, he asked Duke Changmu, you are the steadiest of the 18 saints. Why are you messing around with them? Duke Changmu pondered for a moment, then pulled out a wooden stake that was about a foot thick and 10 feet long with a trembling hand. What messing around, he said in a low voice. I just can't help but want to beat you up. With a whistle, Duke Changmu raised the stake and slapped it down on the Taoist's forehead. Chapter 932. Under Lord Changmu's attack, the void around the long-eyebrowed Taoist suddenly collapsed. The void within a radius of thousands of miles collapsed to a size of about 10 feet, and a rich cyan spirit chi filled the small void. Boundless green vines appeared out of thin air, trapping the long-eyebrowed Taoist, who had become the size of a sesame seed, in this small void. At the same time, the vines wriggled and wrapped around him. Each tree represented a kind of rule formed by the condensation of innate first wood and acquired second wood chi. It could be wind, thunder, loud noises, or poison. The power of first wood and second wood was like a Tai Chi twin fish intertwining with each other, bursting with infinite mystery in the yin-yang eye. Along with a loud boom, lightning burst out from the cyan reiki, and flames surged up. Green soil grew out of the fire, and the moving soil condensed into a mountain high up in the sky, condensing into a thumb-sized seal, silently pressing down on the spot between long eyebrow priest's eyebrows. In this small void, everything originated from the first wood and second wood chi, so the soil that grew was also integrated with the nimbleness of the wind, the elegance of the fire, and the profound meaning that could be derived from the wonderful wood chi. The inconspicuous seal quietly imprinted itself between the long-eyebrowed Taoist's eyebrows, and a clear and dazzling green coat of arms fused deeply into the Taoist's skin. There was only one twisted pattern in the small square coat of arms, which was called Chaos Rune in the world of Chaos Fiend gods. The so-called rune was a text that had no physical form, but only waves of divine will. Anyone who could refine the invisible and traceless Chaos Rune into a physical form was a top existence that no Chaos Fiend god dared to provoke. The twisted green rune in front of him only represented one meaning: poison. Lord Changmu was a primordial chaos immortal of the Tao fusion realm who controlled the wood spirit chi, but the essence of his power was poison, which no one could resist. Like other Chaos Fiend gods, not many people knew the shape of Lord Changmu's true form. As soon as he was born, he shocked all living beings in the universe with his terrible, fierce, and unparalleled poison. The long-browed Taoist shuddered. His entire body turned green, which matched the color of his face just now. After that, a large amount of viscous green pus seeped out of his pores. The old Taoist who had a sage-like demeanor suddenly became like a piece of rotten meat, looking very pathetic. Before the Taoist could cast a spell to break Lord Changmu's attack, Yao Ling chuckled and gently drew a line with her finger, which was fairer than a freshly washed onion. A terrible cracking sound rang out as the small space compressed around Lord Changmu suddenly split open. The part where the void shattered happened to pass through the long-browed Taoist's body, and split in a perfectly symmetrical line between his eyebrows. The long-browed Taoist had just made a hand seal, and the surrounding void collapsed. His body flashed, and the green light around him rippled as he flew out of the shattered void. From between his eyebrows to his lower abdomen, a very fine earthy yellow light was emitting a very faint glow. The light was also present behind him, but it split him in two from the middle. To an existence at the Tao integration stage, this kind of injury would not be life-threatening. However, it would cause too much damage to the long-browed Taoist priest's vitality. With a sway of his body, an exotic fragrance wafted into his nostrils. Purple smoke swirled around him, and plumes of green gas and yellow light kept pouring out of his body. A little annoyed, he pointed at Yao Ling and shouted, "Are you really going to be so cruel, Earth Spirit?" Yao Ling, who looked no more than a teenage girl of 14 or 15, frowned and stared at the Taoist with a hint of bitterness in her eyes as she sighed and said, "What's the point of revealing someone's background? I'm an Earth Spirit, and you're just a long-browed bat. You're nobody to me, so why can't I be cruel to you?" A fierce gleam flashed in her eyes as she suddenly moved to the Taoist's side and stabbed him in the ribs with her bony hands. "You're allowed to block the door and bully the Wahuang clan, but we're not allowed to teach you a lesson. How can there be such logic in this world?" Infected by Lord Changmu's poison, the Taoist's movements were a little slow. Suddenly, Yao Ling struck a sneak attack, plunging her blade-sharp hands deep into his ribs. Amidst the jarring sound of bones breaking, she giggled and flicked her fingers upward, crushing the Taoist's ribs to pieces. The Taoist gave a muffled snort as his body turned into a plume of blue smoke and soared into the sky. The hassock he was sitting cross-legged on disintegrated amidst a loud whistling noise, and then the 49,000 flexible blue grasses that formed it glowed with a dazzling light as they wove into a 13-storied pagoda over his head. The pagoda emitted a boundless blue light that was clearly visible to the naked eye. It was composed of countless extremely fine threads, each of which contained 33,333 words of the Tao League's mantra. The void around them froze, and Yao Ling's movements suddenly slowed down. She pulled out a yellow handkerchief embroidered with an 8 trigrams and threw it out. A gust of yellow wind rolled up, from which a large hand rushed out, grabbed Yao Ling, and threw her to the ground. She gave a strange cry and slammed her head into the divine tree with her 100-mile-long skirt trailing behind her. Her body was sturdy, but the impact created a huge pit 1,000 feet across on the divine tree. She was stuck in the wood with her limbs twisted, shaking her head dizzily. Wu Qi, who was hiding underground and stealing its energy essence, was overjoyed when the divine tree was severely damaged. He hurriedly increased the speed of his stealing. Who could tell how much energy the divine tree had lost after being hit by Yao Ling? The blame was all on the Taoist, and it had nothing to do with Wu Qi. As hot streams kept pouring into Wu Qi's body, Wu Qi was pleasantly surprised to find that this divine tree was indeed worthy of being called the divine tree of fire. Its energy essence actually contained the aura of the origin of all kinds of flames. From the most common flames of firewood in the mortal world to the primordial fire seed, which was as powerful as the divine flame of nirvanic destruction, as Wu Qi's stealing of energy essence continued to increase, tens of millions of fire seeds poured into Wu Qi's body. Wu Qi smiled so widely that his eyes narrowed into slits. In his previous life, the reason why Yuan Ling's alchemy and artifact refining skills were so outstanding among the chaotic fiend gods was not only because of the heaven refining cauldron, but also because he had collected dozens of chaotic fires at the level of the nirvanic desolate flames and refined them into Yuan Ling's true flame. Today, it seemed that with the help of the divine tree of fire, Wu Qi would not need to spend much effort in this lifetime to refine it into a new Yuan Ling's true flame. On top of that, Wu Qi possessed the true flame of Phoenix, a fire seed that even the divine tree did not have. The divine tree only contained natural fire seeds, and it did not have fire seeds like the true flame of Phoenix that had been refined with the blood essence of life. This meant that the Yuan Ling's true flame Wu Qi had refined in this lifetime was more powerful and magical than in his previous life. With the help of the divine tree's endless energy essence, Wu Qi began to fuse all kinds of fire seeds, carefully purifying and compressing them with the fire refining technique of the heaven refining grand magic. He was too lazy to pay attention to the battle going on outside, as all his mind was immersed in the wonderful refining process. Every time he refined it, not only was the fire seed sublimated, but also his fleshly body and magic power were purified and purified. The fact that the Taoist had knocked Yao Ling into the divine tree with a casual blow had triggered Greathorns' reverse scale. Furious, he raised the spear and thrust it at the pagoda hovering over the Taoist's head. "Old bat, how dare you hurt Lao Tzu's manhood? I'll chop it off today." Greathorns bellowed. "Explode!" The spear, shrouded in purple flames, stabbed the green pagoda, and then exploded with a deafening boom. Greathorns had refined the spear with a branch of the divine tree, and he had nurtured it day and night with his own blood, so its power was almost as strong as an ordinary chaotic spirit artifact. As soon as it exploded, the green pagoda shattered and transformed back into 49,000 blades of grass, wheeling around the Taoist. With a cold snort, Greathorns slowly pulled out a crimson, translucent spear that looked as if it were carved out of crystal. As soon as the spear appeared, the surroundings were filled with coolness, as all the heat was sucked into it without any leakage. The Taoist cried out in horror, "You bastard! Greathorns, are you really going to risk your life? Why did you take out your natal artifact?" Wu Divinity, who had been watching the battle from the sidelines, took advantage of the moment when the Taoist panicked and suddenly transformed his head into a triangular one that looked like a viper's. He opened his mouth and sprayed out a cloud of yellow sand mist, all of which sprinkled on the Taoist's shadow. Then, he performed a hand incantation gesture, pulled back and released it, and cried out in a low voice, "Hit!" A mouthful of blood sprayed out of the Taoist's mouth, and half of his body suddenly melted into a paste that gave off a strange smell. The Taoist roared furiously. His whole body glowed with a green light, and the paste reformed. But then, with a flash of yellow light, half of his body turned into paste again. The Taoist chanted a mantra as the green light flickered repeatedly, followed closely by the yellow light. After flashing 36 times in a row, the yellow light exploded into a shower of light and drifted away, and the Taoist's body finally returned to normal, without a trace of injury. The gloomy Taoist did not waste any time. Gritting his teeth, he made a grabbing motion in the air. In the blink of an eye, a bronze swordbreaker with 36 segments, each of which was attached with 4 spirit runes, fell into his hand, gleaming with a dim divine light. Brandishing the 4 feet 9 inch long bronze swordbreaker, the Taoist gritted his teeth and sneered at Greathorns, who was about to stab him with the spear in his hand. "If you really want to risk your life, don't blame me for being merciless." Yao Ling staggered out of the hole, straightened her ridiculously long dress, and flew up into the air with clenched teeth. She chirped, "Wu Qing. Who's afraid of who? Old bat, who's afraid of who? Since we can't kill each other, let's just play. Cut the crap and come at me together. If I don't turn this old bat into 18,000 different things today, I'll change my name and never see anyone again." She simply took off her long skirt and revealed a short dress, then squealed and was about to pounce on the Taoist. But before she could do anything, 3 figures suddenly appeared beside the Taoist. They were 3 old men dressed in the same Taoist robes. Yao Ling was stunned, and she quickly took a few steps back. Greathorns, Lord Changmu, Wu Divinity, and Yao Ling stood in a straight line, staring at each other speechlessly for a long time. After a quarter of an hour, the 4 old Taoists snorted coldly at the same time, and then the Taoist said indifferently, "Well, those 3 rascals are lucky." A white gust of wind blew over, and the 4 Taoists disappeared without a trace. Chapter 933. He spat another mouthful of purple-red phlegm on the ground, vaporizing another chunk of lava. Putting away his natal artifact, Greathorns gritted his teeth as he stared in the direction where the gust of wind had disappeared and muttered, "It's always like this. When they have the upper hand, they keep pestering us, and when they are at a disadvantage, they turn and run. Why is it always like this?" Yao Ling was busy putting on her ridiculously long dress. She carefully smoothed out every crease on it, and the gentle fluctuation of magic power made the dress sway gently like flowing water. The countless flowers embroidered on the 100-mile-long dress seemed to come to life, swaying with the sway of the dress and giving off a floral fragrance. Hearing Greathorns' complaint, Yao Ling rolled her eyes and said with a cold snort, "Haven't you gotten used to it after so many years? They have formed 2 gangs and colluded with each other, doing all kinds of dirty things every day. It's not the first time they have done this. What else do you have to say?" Greathorn snorted coldly. With a gloomy face, he looked at the origin tree of fire, which had been knocked into a large pit, his face twitching with heartache. He clenched his fists tightly and muttered in a low voice. His eyes flashed with an ominous glint, as if he was calculating when he would break into the other's door and destroy some of the valuables in the other's house. The lion man flapped his wings and flew up, looking a little embarrassed. He shook his head helplessly and said, "Master, I'm useless." Greathorns waved his hand and said dryly, "It's none of your business. Just find a chance to kill a few little cow noses next time." The lion man nodded honestly and said seriously, "I'll go to Panga continent tomorrow, and if I see anyone wearing Taoist robes, I'll kill him in secret. I'll come back after I've killed tens of thousands of them." Yao Ling, who was eager to see the world plunged into chaos, cheered him on from the side. "Remember to kill those with high cultivation bases, and they must be at least gold immortals. Aren't you shaming your master by killing those lesser heaven immortals and cultivators?" Light and shadow flickered in the void, and an old man in a black robe, a muscular man with his upper body exposed, and a beautiful woman riding on a 100-legged beetle appeared at the same time. The strong man said in a low, muffled voice, "The cultivation of the long-browed old man's divinity doppelganger is really powerful. I beat him for a long time, but I couldn't kill him. I broke one of his arms and let him escape." The black-robed old man flew up and landed on a branch of the origin tree of fire. He squatted on the branch like a big bird and sighed, then took out a black seal and said with a frown, "I used 108 seals in a row to smash the head of the clone I was dealing with, but he still managed to escape. Next time, I have to think of a way to suppress and seal him even if I can't kill him." Everyone looked at the beautiful woman riding on the back of the centipede beetle. Clad in a pale green robe and with a hint of evil in her eyes, the beautiful woman said in a cold voice, "Why are you looking at me? The clone that I dealt with was stabbed 3 times by me with my natal divine power, and the poison was hidden in his body. When he returned to his original body, the poison would burst out. Old man Long Eyebrows would need at least half a month to expel the poison." Greathorns and the others clapped and laughed when they heard what the woman said, especially Yao Ling, who laughed so hard that she almost plunged into the sea of lava. The 7 Tao fusing experts still maintained the wild and unbridled style of chaos fiend gods. They dared to do and bear responsibility for their actions, loved and hated, distinguished between gratitude and grudges, and could not tolerate even a grain of sand in their eyes. They did not pay much attention to dignity, and when they wanted to laugh, they would just laugh out loud. A faint whistle of wind came from afar, and then a breeze blew 11 tiny shadows toward them. As they came to the side of the crowd, a deep voice rang out, "Why are you laughing so happily? Are you really going to kill that long-browed old man? That would be one less scourge." Wu Divinity heaved a deep sigh and shook his head. "How can we possibly kill him? Lord Wuling said it just now. We have to find a way to suppress a few of them, or destroy their avatars and force them to reincarnate and recultivate. Otherwise, things will be bad for us." As the wind blew, the 7 of them, together with the 11 twisting shadows, formed a circle about 10,000 feet in diameter. Greathorns raised his hand, and 18 streams of golden liquid sprayed out of the sea of lava, which transformed into 18 golden thrones of different shapes under the crowd. Everyone, including the shadows, sat on the thrones and stared blankly at a spot in the middle of the circle. 18 of the 35 strongest experts of Pangu world, the 7 Buddhist patriarchs, the 9 Tao patriarchs, and the 18 saints, had gathered here. Although 11 of them had only manifested as avatars, this was the first time the 18 of them had gathered together in such a formal manner since the creation of the world. Unlike the 7 Buddhist patriarchs and the 9 Tao patriarchs, who had founded their sects to recruit disciples and expand their power, these 18 still maintained the primitive style of chaos fiend gods. Apart from a few who were on good terms with them and occasionally visited them, the others spent most of their time cultivating in seclusion in their own lairs, having their own fun, and never showing up in public. Since they fused with the Tao, even the apocalypse of heaven and earth could do nothing to them, and several of them had gone through dozens of apocalypses without showing up. Legends about them were circulating all over the universe, but they were just like legends. Some people knew their names, but few had seen their true selves. Hiding under the ground, Wuqi was so scared that he dared not to breathe too loudly. It would not be a big deal if there were only 1 or 2 Tao fusing experts, but there were 18 of them, half of all the Tao fusing experts in Panga world. With Wuqi's current cultivation base, if they found him, he would have to go through the transmigration again, just like in his previous life. And this time, Wuqi was stealing the energy essence of the origin tree of fire. If Great Horns found out about this, perhaps Wuqi would not be able to rest in peace even after he went into the transmigration. Given his temper, he would definitely chase Wuqi into the transmigration and kill him. Carefully fusing all his aura with the origin tree of fire, an enormous amount of essence energy kept rushing into Wuqi's body and being refined into the Yuanling true flame by him with the heaven-refining grand magic. At the same time, he carefully extracted the divine power and divine energy of the 3 emperors, constantly strengthening his magic power and cultivation base. This time, Wuqi dared not to extract all the newly born divine power and divine energy from the 3 emperors. After all, there were 18 Tao fusing experts here. If any of them were a little curious and glanced at the 3 emperors and found that they were working hard to heal their injuries, but to no avail, even a pig would know that something was wrong, and Wuqi would be dragged out of the cave. Therefore, Wuqi slowed down the absorption of divine power and divine energy, reserving half of it for the 3 emperors. The complexions of the 3 people gradually became better, and their rapid breathing gradually became longer and longer. But, Wuqi slowed down the process of stealing their divine power and turned his attention to the energy of wood, water, and metal being extracted by the origin tree of fire. In any case, there was no such thing as too much energy. Halfway through, Wuqi robbed another 50% of the energy extracted by the origin tree of fire. With the wonders of the escape technique in Scroll of Stealing, Wuqi's little trick was not discovered by the 18 Tao fusing experts. Perhaps, no one believed that someone would dare to play tricks in front of 18 Tao fusing experts. Even those Buddhist patriarchs and Daozu did not dare to play tricks like this. So, Great Horns and the others just sat there in a daze, and none of them thought to take a closer look at their surroundings. This was Great Horns' lair, a place that was absolutely safe unless attacked by an outsider. Was there a need to be so cautious? Only the lion man squatted on the origin tree of fire, occasionally glancing around with wide eyes, ignoring the situation right below him. The silence went on for 3 days and 3 nights. Finally, Great Horns could not help but ask dryly, "Everyone, talk. What are you holding back?" The silence was broken as a light figure said in a deep voice, "The news we've received from all over the place lately is not good. There is no doubt that Taoist League and Buddhist League are going to join forces to suppress the human race. This time, they have even blocked the gate of Empress Hua's palace. Obviously, they do not want to give the Huang clan a chance to intervene. They are going to take complete control of the human race." Wu Divinity said darkly, "If the human race is completely controlled by them like those mortals in the mortal world and the universe, and if Panga continent falls into their control, then, with the power that Taoist League and Buddhist League have accumulated over the years, the overall strength of their sects will increase by 100 times in less than 1 eons. Among the disciples of Daozu and Buddhist patriarchs, there are many Tao-breaking experts. What if?" Wu Divinity smacked his lips and did not finish his words. Sitting cross-legged on the throne, Yao Ling sighed with a sad face and said, "If a few of their disciples and grand disciples have fused with the Tao, we will be in deep trouble. We are not as united as them, and we can barely fight them because we have 1 more disciple. But if a few of their disciples and grand disciples have fused with the Tao, we will be chased and beaten by them every day. Lord Changmu said in a deep voice, we don't need many. As long as 3 disciples of Taoist League and Buddhist League break through the realm of Tao fusing, given our previous state of disunity, some of us are likely to be sealed and suppressed. If we lose one, there will be a second, a third, a fourth. What are we waiting for? Great Horn said angrily. Wait for them to come and suppress us. Let's fuck them up first. A murderous aura echoed in the small circle, and the terrible killing intent made the Lion Man jump a few times uneasily. Subconsciously, he flew to a higher branch to rest. One of the light figures said in a deep voice, we must form an alliance to protect ourselves. Think back to all these years, how many people of the same origin as us have fallen? How many of them were killed by the schemes of those few? We must join hands and form a complete power like them, recruiting disciples without restraint to protect ourselves. Wu Divinity nodded and said, unknowingly, there are more than 1,000 Tao reasoning experts among their disciples now. If these 1,000 Tao reasoning experts can form a formation with the power of the heavenly Tao, such as the stars and the 6 paths of reincarnation, they will have the overall strength to fight one of us. If they really manage to take control of Pangu continent, hee. The beautiful woman riding on the beetle said in a loud voice, the 18 saints will join hands and form a holy alliance to fight against Buddhist League and Tao League. What do you think? Great Horns was the first to jump to his feet. He waved his fist and said furiously, let's do it. At worst, there will be another apocalypse of heaven and earth. When they send the outer heavenly realms back to Pangu continent, we'll tear it to pieces again. Hee, we'll destroy whatever they want. Everyone else looked at Great Horns with the same meaning in their eyes, idiot. The Lion Man lowered his head and hugged himself with his long wings, not daring to show his face. How did he end up with such a teacher? Chapter 934. The origin tree of fire's energy essence poured into Wu Qi's body along with countless ordinary flames, true flames, heavenly flames, divine flames, and desolate flames. He discarded the ordinary flames that were not powerful enough and casually fused them into the primal purple energy. As for the powerful divine flames, desolate flames, and heavenly flames with unique divine abilities, he carefully collected them one by one, leaving only a handful of each in the heaven refining cauldron. In his previous life, Yuan Ling had spent countless years collecting all kinds of fire seeds, and it had taken him 3 eons to temper them into one, eventually turning them into the mighty and mysterious Yuan Ling true flame. But today, as long as Wu Qi had collected enough fire seeds, he would not need to spend so much time and effort. The total amount of each fire seed he collected in his previous life was enormous, and they were the kind that could destroy a part of the void if he was not careful enough. Gathering dozens of fire seeds was an extremely difficult task, especially to fuse a large number of fire seeds into one. The difficulty was even greater. But now, with the scroll of stealing, a heaven-defying technique, Wu Qi only needed a tiny bit of fire seed to fuse them into one, and he would be able to form the fire seed of Yuan Ling true flame. Then, with the primal purple energy, he would be able to completely transform the vast amount of primal purple energy into new Yuan Ling true flame. It was like kneading dozens of planets into one, or melting dozens of grains of sand into one. How big was the difference in difficulty? Not to mention that Wu Qi had the experience of his previous life, which allowed him to control all the fire seeds with ease. In terms of efficiency alone, it was already thousands of times higher than in his previous life. Especially when Wu Qi was crafting the Yuan Ling true flame in his previous life, he did not have the help of the heaven refining cauldron. But now, he had retrieved the heaven refining cauldron, which he had luckily obtained in his previous life. Tiny fire sparks, as tiny as needles, swayed and drifted in the cauldron. There were all kinds of flames, some cold, some hot, some lukewarm, and some both hot and cold. Among all the fire sparks in the origin tree of fire, there were 36,000 kinds of heavenly flames, 36,000 kinds of divine flames, and 36,000 kinds of desolate flames that caught Wu Qi's attention. A total of 108,000 kinds of extremely powerful fire sparks were now gathered in the cauldron. Carefully activating the heaven refining grand technique, Wu Qi focused most of his attention on the heaven refining cauldron while absorbing the endless divine wood essence. The 18 saints sat together and swore an origin heart oath to form a holy alliance to fight against Daozu and Gautama Buddha together. In terms of numbers, they had one more, and in terms of cultivation base, a few of them were slightly stronger than Daozu and Gautama Buddha. But, as they had said, they, who were used to living a free and unfettered life, were like a plate of loose sand. Compared with the Buddhist League and Tao League, who had established their own sects and recruited disciples, they were far behind. Sitting cross-legged beside the origin tree of fire, they discussed the advantages of the Buddhist League and the Tao League, and the weaknesses of the Holy Alliance. Gautama Buddha and Daozu had established their own sects not long after the world was created. Over the years, these two small groups had struggled and schemed in Panga world, and had survived countless apocalypses of heaven and earth, but they had never fallen. All the former chaos-fiend gods had fallen. Except for the 18 lucky ones, including great horns, all the other chaos-fiend gods had vanished. Only the 17 old Taoists and old monks had supported each other and walked step by step to where they were today. Great horns and the others clearly remembered that in the first 18 apocalypses of Panga world, only one of them, Gautama Buddha and Daozu, had fused with the Tao. However, regardless of whether the other Buddhist ancestors and Tao ancestors had fallen into the cycle of samsara, been suppressed by others, or encountered other great tribulations, these two who had fused with the Tao would always do their best to save others, protecting them as they embarked on the path of cultivation once more. Through the apocalypses, they had always supported each other and forged a very deep bond and tacit understanding. Not only had the two small groups not been destroyed by the apocalypses, but they had fused with the Tao one after another. When the 360th apocalypse of heaven and earth arrived in Panga world, which was also the most terrible one in history, 99% of the disciples of Buddhist League and Tao League were killed, and the remaining 10% fell into transmigration. But, all the 7 Buddhist patriarchs and 9 Tao League stepped into the realm of Tao fusing at the critical juncture of the apocalypse, laying the foundation for the long-term prosperity of Buddhist League and Tao League. The 18 saints clearly remembered that when the last Daozu and the last Buddhist patriarch fused with the Tao, the universe was filled with the despairing roars of chaos-fiend gods before they fell. Their eternal lives came to an abrupt end on that day, and the world was filled with ominous omens of the fall of fiend gods. Blood rained, the sky fell, the earth cracked, and even the sun and moon rose at the same time. Only Mount Gridrakata and heaven beyond heaven were shrouded in auspicious clouds and blooming heavenly flowers. Countless ominous tribulations were rushing toward the two Buddhas and Daozu, who were sitting cross-legged on lotus thrones and fusing with the Tao. At that time, the other 6 Buddhist patriarchs and 8 Tao League were all severely injured in order to protect the last Tao fusing disciple, which they could not recover from even with their cultivation bases of Tao fusing in time. When the apocalypse of heaven and earth was about to wipe out the monk and the Taoist who were on the verge of fusing with the Tao, the chanting of Buddha and the singing of Tao echoed into the sky. The last group of Tao reasoning and Tao breaking disciples from the Buddhist League and Tao League stood before the monk and the Taoist, smiling with a calmness and holiness that stunned the 18 saints. Hundreds of Tao reasoning disciples detonated their divine souls, and dozens of Tao breaking disciples detonated their divine souls. Even their disciples, who were responsible for sprinkling water and sweeping the ground, stood before the Great Tribulation without any regard for their own safety, and detonated the last wisp of their souls. At that time, a rain of blood fell from the sky, washing Mount Gridrakata and heaven beyond heaven. Amidst the blood and flesh of countless disciples, the last monk and the Taoist successfully stepped into the realm of Tao fusing. The 18 saints, who were also struggling in the apocalypse, saw with their own eyes the 7 Buddhist patriarchs and 9 Tao League fall to their knees in the rain of blood, worshipping their lost disciples. 17 Tao fusing monks and Taoists knelt in the rain of blood and wept bitterly. They kowtowed 3 times and 9 times to the fallen disciples with great devotion, again and again, until the apocalypse was completely over. When Yao Ling accidentally mentioned the scene they had seen that day, the 18 saints shut their mouths at the same time. The newly formed Saint League was no different from a plate of loose sand. But what about the Buddhist League and Tao League? Countless apocalypses of heaven and earth had tempered them into a frighteningly stable whole. For so many years, Great Horns, and the others had always been easily suppressed by the Buddhist League and Tao League because they were united, while they had always gone their own way. After a suffocating silence for 7 days and 7 nights, Wu Divinity said in a deep voice, "We have to find a way to destroy their plan to completely control Panga continent. Otherwise, we have no way out. Do we have to return to the chaotic world?" Lord Wuling fiddled with the black seal and said faintly, "My disciples have learned that the Celestial Court is preparing to confer new gods, and the Buddhist League is preparing to erect a new Buddha of transmigration. If these two things succeed, we will be at a complete disadvantage." The 108,000 fire sparks in the cauldron had quietly fused into a fist-sized ball of fire that was as warm and soft as a pearl, and wonderful changes were taking place in it. Wu Qi had immersed 90% of his divine sense into the ball of fire, and only the last 10% was paying attention to the movements in the outside world. According to the information Lord Wuling's disciple had learned, the Celestial Court was preparing to confer new gods. There were 84,000 celestial lords in the Celestial Court today, and their natal stars were formed by the fusion of the laws of heavenly Tao contained in the hundreds of ancient stars Pangu had split apart when he created the world, and the natural energy of Pangu world. However, in addition to these 84,000 ancient stars, a total of 12,575 ancient stars were drawn into Pangu world when it was created. Over the years, the 9 Daozu had expended tremendous efforts, and finally, without affecting the general trend of the starry sky of Pangu world, they had broken the cores of 6,000 ancient stars and released 996,000 laws of the Great Tao from them. When the outer heavenly realms returned to Pangu continent this time, the enormous amount of natural energy they had accumulated over the years was left in their original positions and bred into new stars. Each of these newborn stars was fused with a law of the Great Tao. It would not be long before the Celestial Court had 996,000 stars to confer celestial lords. If the Celestial Court's plan succeeded, the Celestial Court would have 1,080,000 celestial lords who had inherited the power of the ancient stars, and the Celestial Court's control over Pangu world would be unshakable. In the Buddhist League, the 7 Buddhist patriarchs had secretly trained 108 proud disciples over the years. It was said that they were the reincarnations of Buddhas who had fallen in previous apocalypses, and their foundation and comprehension were several times stronger than that of the current Lord Buddha, Amitabha. These 108 Buddhas would be conferred as Buddhas of reincarnation, stationed in the 6 paths of reincarnation in the netherworld, and completely mastered the law of reincarnation with the help of the Buddhist formation. If these two plans succeeded, the Celestial Court would rule the sky, and the Buddhist League would control the earth. With that, the whole Pangu world would be completely under the control of the Buddhist League and Tao League. The formation formed by the 1,080,000 stars and the 6 paths of reincarnation could simulate almost half of the heavenly Tao of Pangu world. Although it could not kill a Tao fusing expert like Great Horns, the Buddhist League and Tao League could suppress the 18 saints with the help of the formation, making them struggle in the transmigration forever, unable to regain the supreme divine abilities they had now. The 18 saints fell silent once again. Wu Qi, on the other hand, was terrified by the news. The Celestial Court was going to confer 1,080,000 celestial lords. The Buddhist League was going to completely control the 6 paths of reincarnation. What kind of joke was that? If they were really able to control the great power of heaven and earth, the 18 saints would certainly be doomed. If Wu Qi succeeded in fusing with the Tao in the future, the 7 Buddhist patriarchs and the 9 Tao patriarchs might rush to Wu Qi's doorstep, shatter his Dharma body, and drive his indestructible true spirit into the transmigration. Then, he would be trapped in the mortal world forever, never to rise again. I must foil their plan. I can't let them succeed. As Wu Qi's heart raced, the flame spark in the heaven-refining cauldron suddenly shrank and merged perfectly with Wu Qi's will. With the help of the boundless fire energy in the origin tree of fire, Wu Qi had quietly reformed the Yuan Ling true flame, which was even more powerful than in his previous life, and had more variations in his divine abilities. Wu Qi was so overjoyed that he almost shouted out loud. Just then, Great Horns glared impatiently at the 3 emperors. Why haven't these 3 fools recovered from their injuries yet? What do they think this place is? Wu Qi's heart sank. He carefully retracted his aura and all his divine abilities, then cautiously fled into the distance along an erupting lava torrent. Following the torrent, he was washed far, far away in the blink of an eye. Chapter 935. Cautiously, Wu Qi withdrew from Greathorns' territory, not daring to leak even the slightest aura. Cautiously, he followed an energy vein on the back of Pangu continent to the front edge, where he tore open the void next to a mountain full of violent thunderbolts that had just manifested from the chaotic energy and stepped into it. He could not leave any clues for Greathorns and the others to track down. Even though he had erased any traces of his existence with the primal purple energy, there was no guarantee that some of the 18 saints with amazing divine abilities could find some traces that Wu Qi had left behind. The safest way was to return to Great Wu through the netherworld. Naturally, the netherworld was the best way. In the boundless netherworld, in the boundless yellow spring of the netherworld, countless ghosts were struggling and roaring in the yellow spring. Those ferocious yellow spring yakshas were laughing wildly, controlling all kinds of giant beasts, running back and forth in the yellow spring, picking up and stuffing delicious ghosts into their stomachs. A group of about 10,000 yakshas were even casting huge nets on the rolling waves of the yellow spring, catching a large number of ghosts with their nets like human fishermen. When Bodhisattva Kitagarbha and others were guarding the nether world, these yakshas did not have the courage to hunt ghosts for food. But now, the yellow spring had become their world, and the bodhisattvas and arhats of the Buddhist League's nether world had not appeared for a long time. Naturally, these yakshas were happy to follow their instincts. With a cold snort, Wu Qi smashed down with a palm thunder. Tens of thousands of yakshas howled miserably as they were blown into a mass of sticky, foul-smelling yellow liquid that melted into the yellow spring. Wu Qi glanced around and saw that there were still many yakshas wreaking havoc in the distance. With a gloomy face, he sped along the way and killed all of them with a flick of his hand. Even those yakshas who had fled into the depths of the yellow spring were hunted down by his immense divine sense and crushed to death, leaving no survivors wherever he went. Looking at the scene of these yakshas wreaking havoc and killing the ghosts, Wu Qi could not help but feel a little regretful. If he had known that this would happen, he would have left a few bodhisattvas and arhats to guard this place. It was like the relationship between a pack of wolves and a herd of sheep. Wu Qi had wiped out the wolves of the Buddhist League and the netherworld in one fell swoop, and these yakshas were like the sheep. They flourished without restraint. As the flock of sheep grew stronger, the spirits of the undead, which were like grass, were naturally unlucky. The souls of these people were swallowed by the yakshas, so more or less Wu Qi had to bear the blame. With a gloomy face, Wu Qi counted with his fingers and couldn't help but be shocked. His merit had decreased a lot. If he hadn't accumulated too much merit in the past, he would have been plagued by karma. Looking helplessly at the boundless yellow spring, Wu Qi murmured, "I didn't kill them, but they died for me." TSK, the entanglement of karma is really powerful. I've only been escorting Yu Ji and the others to their reincarnation, and yet I've provoked this group of bald donkeys. I've only punished them, but in the end, I've killed so many undead and ghosts. I'll have to be more careful in the future. Who knows how many things will be involved. With this enlightenment, Wu Qi's state of mind became clear. The divine energy he had stolen from Emperor Qing and the others, and the enormous energy essence he had stolen from the origin tree of fire, had all been transformed into primal purple energy and filled his body. Wu Qi's body turned blurry, as if a void was slowly taking shape inside of him. Inside of him, intertwining starlight turned into countless nebulae, spinning ceaselessly. Then, a ball of white flame, bright and quiet like a pearl, slowly spread out inside of him, gradually fusing into his limbs and bones. Wu Qi's body trembled slightly as he stood over the yellow spring. The interstitial world inside of him was slowly disintegrating and fusing with him. From now on, there would be no distinction between the interstitial world and Wu Qi. Once the fusion was complete, he would be a world of his own. The heaven-refining grand magic was running at full speed. The enormous energy in the interstitial world, as well as the countless energy veins and mountains, were all absorbed and digested by Wu Qi's body. A ball of bright light appeared in his palm, and a small world was embedded in it. Countless heavenly ghosts were living freely in this world, and they had no idea what strange changes had taken place in the outside world. Wu Qi smiled. With a flash of bright light in his palm, the yellow spring, which spanned 1,000,000,000,000 miles around him, disappeared in an instant, sucked into the small world along with the countless yakshas inside it. He decided to give those heavenly ghosts something to temper themselves with. Only by tempering them with these ferocious and brutal yakshas would he be able to produce strong enough heavenly ghost soldiers. The sticky water of the yellow spring slowly filled the gap. Wu Qi breathed out a mouthful of white smoke that smelled faintly fragrant. He glanced around, then suddenly plunged into the filthy water. The water of the yellow spring had completely swallowed up the slightest trace that Wu Qi might have left behind, and there was no longer a need to worry that anyone could track him with divine abilities. His body was still rapidly digesting the benefits he had gained in the past few days. The divine power and divine energy he had stolen from Green Emperor, White Emperor, and Black Emperor had only raised Wu Qi's cultivation base to the limit of the 6th tier of Tao breaking. But, the enlightenment of the heavenly Tao in the core of their divine souls had given Wu Qi endless benefits. He lay in the yellow spring, drifting with the waves as his divine soul gradually absorbed and digested the enlightenment. The water around him was gradually transformed by his aura, and in the boundless yellow spring, a clear pond of water with lotus flowers growing out of it. This was a wisp of aura that leaked out when Wu Qi merged the great Tao of Green Emperor and Black Emperor. The water of the yellow spring was also water, and it was still under the control of the law of water. Since Wu Qi had merged with Black Emperor's enlightenment of the great Tao, he could naturally transform the nature of water at will. As for the lotus flowers, they were the manifestation of Green Emperor's aura. As the yellow spring drifted slowly, the divine power and divine energy of the three emperors were completely digested by Wu Qi, and his cultivation base had stabilized at the limit of the 6th tier of Tao-breaking realm. After that, he began to fuse with the enormous energy he had stolen from the origin tree of fire with all his might. An enormous amount of primal purple energy was produced, gradually compressed into his essence, and fused with his body. After breaking through the 6th tier of Tao-breaking realm, Wu Qi drifted above the yellow spring for a whole month. With the help of the energy he had stolen from the origin tree of fire, his cultivation base broke through all the way to the 4th tier of Tao-breaking realm. Wu Qi could not help but be struck speechless. Just how enormous was the energy contained in that origin tree of fire? If he could really take human form and cultivate sentience, wouldn't he be able to step into the Tao-fusing realm right away? No wonder great horns attached so much importance to the origin tree of fire. He had been cultivating beside it day and night, and his spirit, energy, and soul had resonated with it. If the origin tree of fire could take human form, they would be as close as brothers and sisters, and he would have a great helper of the Tao-fusing realm. Unfortunately, after being ravaged by Wu Qi, the time for the origin tree of fire to take human form had been delayed by at least a few eons. What Wu Qi had stolen was his fundamental energy essence, which was not something that could be replenished in just a few days. But, this debt should be put on the old Taoist's head, shouldn't it? Everyone had seen with their own eyes that it was he who had used a divine ability to smash Xiaoling into the origin tree of fire, creating a big hole in it. At the thought of that, Wu Qi could not help but chuckle. It had taken him a month to turn all the energy he had stolen into his own, and his cultivation base had remained firmly at the 4th tier of the Tao-breaking realm. His fleshly body had been tempered by the power of Yuan Ling's true flame, and his overall strength was more than 100 times stronger than a month ago. But, it would take him some time to absorb the essence of the great Tao he had stolen from the three emperors. After all, the power of Wu Qi's divine soul was far weaker than that of these three old monsters who had existed since the creation of the world. If he wanted to absorb all their attainments, he would have to at least improve his divine soul to the same level as theirs. Suddenly, a faint light shone in front of him as Wu Qi drifted casually along the yellow spring and was sent to the vicinity of the 6 paths of reincarnation. Lazily rising to his feet, Wu Qi looked in the direction of the 6 paths of reincarnation, and what he saw stunned him. The mountain range he had completely destroyed was once again in the yellow spring. The mountain was densely covered with exotic flowers and plants, and a faint aroma wafted over, washing away the foul smell of the yellow spring. Countless exquisite and gorgeous palaces had been built on the mountain, and a large group of bodhisattvas and arhats of the netherworld were pitifully building a new palace with countless materials like coolies on the street. The leader of the construction workers was none other than Bodhisattva Kittagarbha, who once ruled the netherworld. With a bitter face, Kittagarbha was holding a small tile carved from green jade, which was as thin as a cicada's wing and about the size of a fingernail, and carefully pasted it on the outside of an exquisite palace. All the materials of the palace, whether they were bricks, tiles, beams, or pillars, were piled up with this extremely thin, small, and exquisite material. Therefore, the palace was transparent from the inside to the outside, emitting streams of colorful light, and looked as beautiful as a dream. How extravagant! Using bodhisattvas as coolies? Wu Qi was stunned. Who was torturing people like this? The roof of the palace was thousands of feet in circumference, and the whole roof was piled up with such small and exquisite tiles. Between the 18 layers of tiles, countless pearls and jades were inlaid as decorations. All the pearls and jades were carved into specific shapes and had to be inlaid with exquisite techniques. This work was not tiring for Kittagarbha, but it was too torturous. And obviously, no magic power was allowed to be used in the construction process, so it could only be completed by manual labor. Wu Qi looked at Kittagarbha, who was carefully piling the tiles on the roof, and could not help but feel a little embarrassed. If he had not kidnapped them, today's incident would not have happened. While he was wondering who was torturing Kittagarbha and the other monks, he suddenly heard a harsh rebuke coming from a great hall on the top of the mountain. Trash, a bunch of trash. Didn't I ask you to collect the tears of the first cry of 4,900 virgin girls with specific birthdays and bloodlines? Why haven't you succeeded after so long? Why do I still keep you? Tell me, why do I still keep you? I can kill a dog and eat its meat, but what can you monks eat if I kill you? Ah! Your meat stinks. A mass of colorful light drifted out of the hall. Dozens of whips of light lashed wildly in the air, and a dozen arhats were covered in blood as they rolled down from the top of the mountain with their heads in their hands. While Wu Qi was in a daze, the figures suddenly saw Wu Qi, and let out a shrill, unpleasant roar that towered into the sky. Who dares to peep at me? A ball of colorful thunderbolt the size of a green bean came whistling through the air and shot straight at the spot between Wu Qi's eyebrows. Chapter 936. Wu Qi reached out his hand to grab the thunderbolt, but in the blink of an eye, the fine hairs on his forehead stood on end as an unprecedented sense of danger came rushing at him. Instinctively, he transformed into a beam of green light that looked like raindrops and soared into the sky, then reappeared in the sky. The thunderbolt brushed past Wu Qi and landed on the yellow spring. A graceful moan rang out, and then, the water within a radius of 10,000 miles, along with everything in it, vanished completely amidst the dancing, colorful light. Time, space, yellow spring, ghosts, yikshaws, and all the power of the great Tao, everything within a radius of 10,000 miles had vanished. Wu Qi swallowed in horror. He stared at the hemispherical gap in the yellow spring, then narrowed his eyes at the man shrouded in the colorful light on the mountain. He was the fiend from another domain who had forced Wu Qi to flee in a panic. And, according to the subtle aura emanating from him, he was probably born and raised in the chaos, and was the real fiend ancestor born from the chaos. The so-called ancestor was an existence who had the right to start a new clan. Just like Ao Buzan, he was called Arko Zu Long, because he was born with an aura of creation. He had the right, the ability, and the obligation to create a new clan. In Wu Qi's previous life, Yuan Ling, he did not have that aura of creation. Therefore, Yuan Ling lived a lonely life, and in the end, he was killed by the joint forces of Chaos Fiend gods. The fiend in front of him had a strange aura that Wu Qi had sensed from Ao Buzan. He should be a real fiend ancestor. Existences like him were not easy to deal with. They often had very outrageous and terrifying innate divine abilities. For example, Ao Buzan's innate divine ability was a shockingly strong reproductive ability. He was a male dragon's, and wherever he went, he would plant his seeds. And, as long as they fused with him, they would definitely give birth to some kind of new and unique dragons. The gap in the yellow spring gradually disappeared, and the water of the yellow spring slowly filled it. Wu Qi gave the colorful light a look and said with a wry smile, "I'm just a passerby. I hope fellow Taoist will show some mercy to me. I have no intention of coveting your Taoist right temple." Now, Wu Qi, who had transformed into the imperial advisor of 7 killing, had changed his appearance slightly. With his current cultivation base, no one could see his true face. Therefore, neither the colorful ball of light nor Kitagarbha, who was working as a laborer, recognized him as the man who broke into the nether world, abducted the nether branch of the Buddhist League, and then used them as scapegoats to block the fiend patriarch in the colorful ball of light. The light flashed rapidly, and then, a pair of white and tender palms emerged. It was a pair of peerlessly beautiful palms that didn't have the slightest blemish. They were lustrous, white, and smooth, and the tips of her fingers carried specks of healthy red. Even every single line on her fingers was exquisite and natural, and there wasn't a trace of anything that could be judged. The pair of beautiful palms kept drawing in the void, quickly drawing out 3 talismans that were shaped like glistening gems and glinting with blue light. As soon as the 3 talismans came together, a cracking sound rang out, and the void around Wu Qi suddenly exploded. The terrible distortion of space pulled at Wu Qi's body, trying to crush his body, his divine soul, and everything about him into the tiniest particles, and finally turn them into nothingness under the bombardment of some mysterious force. This force reminded Wu Qi of the power called annihilation in some extremely dangerous places in the chaos, places that even chaos fiend gods did not dare to approach rashly. With a furious snort, Wu Qi waved his hands and swung them out. His muscles rolled like raging waves, and his tremendous physical strength forcibly pulled the exploding void to his side. His immense divine sense sealed off the void. No matter how the force of annihilation raged, it could not shake the space imprisoned by Wu Qi. Furious, Wu Qi took a step and rushed in front of the colorful light. Without using any divine ability or magic, he just brutally stamped his foot on the light. In ancient times, before the creation of the world, when chaos fiend gods fought, who would use any divine ability or magic? Apart from the ancient stars that were brewing in the chaos, there was no law of the great Tao, and there were no divine abilities or mystic arts. Therefore, people simply used their strong fleshly bodies, picked up everything around them, and smashed it. Wu Qi's kick had the fighting style of a chaos fiend god, relying on his strong fleshly body to bully others. His 2 tender hands slapped toward Wu Qi's foot. As he was also born in the chaos world, this fiend could be considered a kind of chaos fiend god. Therefore, it was almost instinctive for him to fight with his fleshly body. When the feet and hands collided, not even the slightest force spread out, and not even the slightest sound of explosion could be heard. Wu Qi and the fiend had withstood all the force. Wu Qi gave a cold snort as he staggered back a dozen steps with the tendons on the soles of his feet nearly shattered. Meanwhile, the fiend roared furiously as both of his palms were crushed by Wu Qi's feet. His bones, flesh, and blood were all jumbled up like rotten eggplants. Clearly, purely in terms of fleshly body, Wu Qi, who was only at the 4th tier of Tao breaking realm, had an overwhelming advantage. The fiend roared wildly. A beam of colorful light wheeled around his palms for a while, and then they were quickly repaired. A white flower shaped like a lily, but with very long and thin petals, drifting gracefully like smoke, appeared out of thin air in his hand. Like a hammer, the fist-sized flower tore through the void and smashed down toward Wu Qi's head. Wu Qi gave a cold snort. Suddenly, he opened his mouth, and the Yuanling true flame, which he had just refined and had not yet fully nourished, turned into a stream of faint white smoke and rushed out. The lily burst into a raging fire, and like a comet plunging into the atmosphere, it smashed down toward Wu Qi's face. The Yuanling true flame wrapped around the fiend's palms and rushed into the colorful light. The dazzling light was burning fiercely, emitting a dazzling fragrance. Kitagarbha and the other bodhisattvas and Arhat Chichi were sitting cross-legged on the ground. Their hands were also locked into the fixed fundamental incantation gesture, trying hard to protect their souls from being shaken by the fragrance. As soon as the arhats with lower cultivation bases were inhaled by the fragrance, faint fires suddenly burst out from under their feet and burned their golden bodies to ashes, leaving only a few relics behind. The multicolored light was completely burned away, revealing the demon inside. The lily smashed heavily into Wu Qi's face. The flower was not heavy, so it shattered to pieces in front of Wu Qi's tough skin. But, the terrible evil force rushed straight into Wu Qi's spiritual sea and smashed into Wu Qi's divine soul with a terrible cold that could destroy all spiritual bodies. Wu Qi shuddered, and the primordial purple energy quickly transformed into the Yuan Ling true flame. Raging flames swept across his body and filled every part of it. The evil force and the Yuan Ling true flame melted and devoured each other. In just a few breaths of time, more than 70% of Wu Qi's magic power had been consumed. After giving the fiend a horrified look, Wu Qi tore open the void and fled without saying a word. If he had the cultivation base of Yuan Ling in his previous life, Wu Qi was confident that he could turn this fiend into ashes. But now, Wu Qi's cultivation base was only at the 4th tier of Dao breaking, which was a huge gap between him and this fiend. If he was not careful, his foundation might be shaken by her weird fiend technique. So, it was better to run away. Yes, this fiend was a she. Wrapped in the colorful light was a beautiful girl wearing a translucent armor that looked like it was carved out of rainbow crystals. The armor was more generous than the bikini swimsuits Wu Qi had seen before. It only covered a small part of her breasts, and barely covered the vital parts of her body. Apart from that, most of her fair skin was exposed. However, this young girl had a head of long hair that shone with rainbow light, as if it was completely made of light. Aside from her snow-white arms and a pair of exquisite and beautiful little feet, the rest of her body could only be seen from time to time, so she didn't have to worry about being seen all over. At first glance, the girl seemed to be 13 or 14 years old, but her deep eyes were filled with an evil and ferocious look that made Wu Qi's scalp numb. There was no innocence or kindness that a normal girl should have. A thin sheet of Yuan Ling true flame coiled around the girl's palm, burning her skin and making her flesh sizzle. The girl seemed to be in extreme pain, as a dark red tear suddenly fell from her left eye. The girl's face twisted with pain. Her head swayed slightly, and the teardrop flew up gracefully, making an arc in the air as it smashed forcefully into Wu Qi's back. Wu Qi, who had just ripped open the void and escaped from the netherworld, gave a muffled snort. The power contained in the tear was simply appalling. A loud bang rang out from Wu Qi's body, and he was knocked flying away by the tiny tear. The place where Wu Qi broke open the void and returned to Pangu continent happened to be a blessed land with picturesque scenery and abundant natural energy. Hundreds of heaven immortals and nascent divinity cultivators were fighting over this blessed land. Below them, nearly 30,000 cultivators below the realm of nascent soul were engaged in a fierce battle in the void that spanned hundreds of miles across. The cultivators of two sects, clad in black and white Taoist robes respectively, had their swords flashing in the void while thunder magic shook the heaven and earth. Both sides were fighting desperately, and from time to time, cultivators fell from the sky. Wu Qi ripped open the void and escaped. The tear knocked him forward and knocked him right into the middle of the two groups of heaven immortals who were fighting. It was like a steel chariot had crashed into a chicken coop, and those heaven immortals were the eggs in the coop. Wherever Wu Qi passed, dozens of heaven immortals exploded into blood and gore without making a sound. Then, colorful light flickered, and the fiend came chasing after him from the netherworld. The cultivators from both sects were taken aback when Wu Qi bumped into the battle just now. But, they did not see clearly that it was Wu Qi who had killed a dozen of their ancestral masters. When they saw the fiend rush out of the battle, shrouded in colorful light, they subconsciously threw their flying swords and thunder magic at the fiend. Destroy! The fiend gently crooked her finger, and a very thin beam of colorful light descended from the sky and landed lightly on the top of the main peak in the middle of the blessed land. A ring of colorful light spread rapidly from the main peak into all directions. The colorful cloud was as beautiful as the morning glow, and it swept across the sky with a pleasant celestial tune. Wherever the colorful cloud passed, all cultivators disappeared completely, but not a flower, not a blade of grass, not even a tiny bug was accidentally hurt. Far away, Wuqi coughed out a mouthful of blood and fled in a sorry state. The fiend girl hovered alone in the sky above the blessed land, narrowed her eyes and gave a creepy smile. "You're running fast, but I'll find you. No one can come out unscathed after hurting me." Wuqi, who had fled far away, felt a burning sensation on his back. A strange dark red emblem with wisps of flame emerged from his back, burning his skin and flesh and producing a sizzling noise. Terrified, Wuqi clenched his teeth and cursed in a low voice, "Not good." Chapter 937. Wuqi could not stop praising Gigu Zi's divine ability. Gigu Zi had only comprehended the general principle of this heavenly star-fleeing armor art, yet it was already so miraculous. Once he mastered it, wouldn't he have the power to frighten even ghosts and gods? Wuqi admired Gigu Zi from the bottom of his heart. How many years had he been cultivating in a proper manner? Gigu Zi and Mod rose to their feet in surprise and asked Wuqi what had happened. Wuqi had been away for more than a month this time. Why did he look so gloomy when he came back? Normally, Wuqi would never treat people like this. Now, he was like a cat whose tail had been burned. His eyes shone with a ferocious gleam, as if he wanted to scratch anyone he did not like. Wuqi looked at Gigu Zi in surprise and said with a smile, "As long as there is a way. No matter what, as long as it doesn't interfere with my magic power and doesn't expose my location, I can always find a way to destroy it completely." If Wuqi's cultivation base was the same as that of the fiend from the outer domain, the strength of her divine sense would be at least 10 times stronger than Wuqi's. Currently, the fiend's cultivation base was at the limit of the Tao-breaking realm. Unless Wuqi stepped into the Tao-fusing realm and merged his divine soul with the heavenly Tao, he could not possess a divine sense twice as strong as hers. Extremely fine silver light poured out of the array, spinning rapidly around the soul-locking seal on Wuqi's back like tiny silver needles. Gradually, a large number of silver patterns began to emerge on the edge of the dark red soul-locking seal. As the number of silver patterns increased, the energy ripples emanating from the seal became weaker and weaker, and the energy required for Wuqi to unleash the seal was getting smaller and smaller. Wuqi sat cross-legged on the altar, his upper body bare. The faintly flashing red soul-locking seal looked particularly glaring on his fair skin. Gigu Zi, on the other hand, was very interested in it. After listening to Wuqi's description of it, he knew that the biggest problem was that it had taken too much of Wuqi's magic power and weakened his strength. While they were discussing the mysteries of the stellar escape art, a beam of light flew over from a distance. It was Wu Tianming. It was midnight. On the altar made of 5-colored soil, Gigu Zi held a peachwood sword in his hand and walked in the yew steps, circulating energy around him. All kinds of magical items were placed neatly on the altar. As Gigu Zi cast the spell, they would fly up into the sky from time to time, forming into a small and exquisite formation that followed the orbits of the stars in the sky 100 miles above the ground. But, when he saw the dozen or so flying swords that Wuqi had thrown out casually, Reverend White River, the current sect master of White River Sect, who was also the founding patriarch of White River Sect, shuddered from head to toe. Joyfully, he brought all his disciples and grand-disciples to kowtow to Wuqi, calling him Master. Because of the soul-locking seal, Wuqi had to spend a great deal of magic power to isolate the energy fluctuations it released. Wuqi estimated that the soul-locking seal was so strong that it would cost him 40% of Wuqi's magic power to isolate its fluctuations. In other words, the damned soul-locking seal had reduced Wuqi's fighting strength by 40%. Although he had the cultivation base of a 4th-tier Tao-breaking expert, the actual fighting strength he could exert was about the level of a peak 5th-tier Tao-breaking expert. The sharp pain kept coming, and Wuqi saw stars in front of his eyes. His hands kept changing incantation gestures, and he slapped out thousands of hand seals on his body. The flame on the dark red seal on Wuqi's back, the size of a man's head, gradually dissipated, and the pain eased a little. But, the seal was still there. It looked like it was carved out of crystal, and there was a faint dark red gleam flickering in it, emitting a faint buzzing sound from time to time. Wu Qi was in a bad mood, so his words and expressions were not polite. The immortals and cultivators of White River sect were stunned, and they could not help but feel a little angry. As the sect leader of White River sect, although he had brought all his disciples to join Great Wu, he did not think that he was here to be a servant. What Wu Qi did to them was a little insulting and trampling on their self-esteem. A woman's heart is the most vicious. Wu Qi felt that he had been wronged. Why did he provoke this damned fiend for no reason? He swore to himself that he would break through to the Tao fusing realm as soon as possible, and then use every means possible to manipulate this fiend into all kinds of shapes. If he wanted to locate the true form of the soul-locking seal, he would have to use his divine sense. But, the fiend's divine sense was much stronger than Wu Qi's, and the divine sense restrictive spell she had laid out was extremely mysterious. Wu Qi could not find the target at all now, so how could he devour the seal? After pondering for a while, Wu Qi carefully exercised the scroll of stealing, preparing to devour the seal. But, no matter how hard Wu Qi tried, he could not find the exact location of the seal. The seal existed between reality and illusion, and even with Wu Qi's cultivation base, he could not find out how it existed. Filled with anger and displeasure, Wu Qi transformed into a beam of golden light and flew into the imperial advisor's mansion. The golden light dispersed, and Wu Qi walked out of it just in time to hear the old man's words. Raising his eyebrows, Wu Qi said grumpily, "You're selling yourself to join us? Well, I don't have time to talk to you. You'll be our outer sect disciples for now. If you can do your job well and are really sincere about joining us, we can take you as inner sect disciples in the future." Wu Qi carefully remembered this taboo, so he had to be careful in everything he did in the future. With a gloomy face, Wu Qi accepted the kowtow from Reverend White River and the others, then flicked his sleeve and drove them out of the Great Hall. The soul shackle seal was a curse that those chaos fiend gods with extremely powerful divine sense were especially good at. It could condense their own blood essence and immense divine sense into a curse and brand it on the enemy. Even if they were thousands of mountains and rivers away, even if they had gone through thousands of reincarnations, the seal would still attach itself to the enemy, allowing the person who placed the curse to find the enemy. Just as he was working hard, the seal suddenly lit up, and wisps of flame began to burn again. Wu Qi hastily performed dozens of hand incantation gestures and sealed the seal once again. The flame burned his body, and the pain made Wu Qi's forehead break out in cold sweat. Cursing the evil woman in a low voice, Wu Qi took many detours and used all kinds of means to erase any traces he might leave behind, then returned to Great Wu. He had never eaten pork, but he had seen a live pig. Reverend White River had seen a few gold immortals fighting from afar, and he recognized that the flying swords thrown out by Wu Qi were all gold immortal artifacts. For heaven's sake, Reverend White River only had a 10th grade heaven immortal artifact, which he had painstakingly asked an artificer to craft for him. Never in his wildest dreams did he expect that Wu Qi would give him a gold immortal artifact as a greeting gift, and it was a dozen of them. In the main hall of Great Wu's Imperial Advisor's mansion, Gigu, Zi and Mod sat high up on the throne, while a dozen heaven immortals and more than 100 nascent divinity cultivators stood in awe and trepidation. An old man with the cultivation base of a 9th-tier heaven immortal bowed respectfully and said, "Seniors, the White River sect sincerely wishes to submit to you. If you don't mind our lack of talent, we are willing to submit to you and be at your beck and call." It was a matter of talent, and no one could help but envy him. Mod furrowed his brows. He was most proficient in forging all kinds of equipment, so he was not very knowledgeable in techniques related to divine sense. Furthermore, he had no interest in divine abilities or secret techniques, so he was unable to help with the soul-locking seal. Only when he saw Gigazi and Mod did Wu Qi's expression return to normal. With one swift move, he tore off the upper part of his shirt, spun around and showed them the soul-locking seal that was about the size of a human head. After that, he briefly told them what he had encountered during the journey. "Damn you, woman! What did I do to offend you? While dealing with the severe pain brought to his fleshly body by the seal, Wuqi exercised a mystic art to isolate the faint ripples that the seal constantly emanated to the outside world. The fiend was not the only one who could sense the fluctuation of the soul-locking seal. Anyone who was close enough to Wuqi could also sense the existence of the seal. The heavenly star escaping art was a mystic art that Gigu Zi had created by himself after he stepped into the Tao reasoning realm and comprehended the heavenly secret. Using the power of the stars in the universe, he could transform it into the starry sky in the most minute details, which contained endless mysteries. Now, Gigu Zi had just compiled the first chapter of the heavenly star escaping art, and had just formed the general outline of this mystic art. After pondering for a long time, Gigu Zi nodded slowly and said slowly, "I do have a way to try. But I've only studied this technique for a short period of time, so I'm not sure if it can solve your problem." Although Wuqi was cultivating the scroll of stealing, and his fleshly body and divine soul had fused with the primal purple energy, which made it impossible for the heavenly Tao to detect his existence, and it was extremely difficult for the enemy to locate him with the Tao of divination, the soul-locking seal had already attached itself to Wuqi's body. It was like an invisible man being sprayed with dog poop, and the unpleasant smell was enough to expose his whereabouts. Wuqi was the unlucky invisible man, and the soul-locking seal was a basin of dog poop. Great Wu was a good place, and the 3 imperial advisors were good people. Now, not to mention Wuqi's bad attitude, even if Wuqi picked Reverend White River up and scolded him every day, he would not leave. With such a generous master and such a profound foundation in Great Wu, this was a good thing that he could not ask for even if he begged for it. As Gigu Zi recited the spell, circles of small whirlwinds swirled and spread out in all directions, while the stars in the sky poured down their power like raindrops and fused into the formation that followed the trajectory of the stars. It took 6 hours, and when a red glow rose from the east, Gigu Zi, who was sweating profusely, stopped the spell. With a flick of his sleeve, a dozen flying swords fell to the ground, then flew up and hovered in front of the crowd. "Someone, take them to the side courtyard and pick a house to stay in." Wuqi snapped, "Don't let them run around if there's nothing important, and find something for them to do in a few days. TSK, these flying swords are a greeting gift. Leave now." Wuqi's energy was flowing nimbly, no longer consumed. The soul-locking seal was sealed by the powerful star power and could no longer release any fluctuation. Unless the cultivation base of one's divine sense was at least twice as strong as that of the person who cast the curse, one could not break the seal by force. Otherwise, the seal would be like a maggot in one's bones, and no matter where one ran, one could not get rid of it. However, the person who cast the curse was a fiend from another domain. This kind of fiend was not very strong in physical strength, but their divine sense was exceptionally strong. 90% of their bodies were composed of the power of divine sense, so they had a unique advantage in terms of the cultivation base of their divine sense. However, Gigu Zi also cautiously reminded Wuqi that the heavenly star's escape art could only work in places where the starlight shone. If someone used magic power to isolate the starlight, the spell would immediately lose its effect. But, if the formation could isolate the starlight, the fluctuation of the seal would not be able to spread out, and it would not have much effect on Wuqi. Chapter 938. After that, Wuqi spent 3 months in seclusion. He devoted himself to refining his divine sense and absorbing the enlightenment of the heavenly Tao left by the Green Emperor and others. Every day, he made gratifying gains. As the first batch of gods born after the creation of the world, their enlightenment of the heavenly Tao came directly from the most primitive and ancient power of the laws of this world. After 3 months of hard work, Wuqi's attainments in wood, water, metal, and related divine abilities and mystic arts had made great strides forward. During these 3 months, Great Wu prepared for the Great War, while Gigu Zi and Mod opened their sects to recruit disciples. With the overall strength of peak-level gold immortals they had shown, the news of their recruitment spread like a gust of wind to Great Wu and its surroundings. In just 3 months, more than 100 immortal sects had come to join them, including more than 2,000 heaven immortals, more than 10,000 nascent divinity cultivators, and hundreds of thousands of other cultivators. Together with their families and clansmen, more than 10 million people had integrated into Great Wu. All the heaven immortals and cultivators were accepted as disciples by Gigu, Z and Mod. Those who liked to study divine abilities and mystic arts were naturally Gigu, Z's disciples, those who liked artifact crafting and forging were Mod's disciples, and some who were inclined to other miscellaneous Taoist studies were all thrown into Wu Qi's tutelage. However, as Wu Qi had been in seclusion for 3 months, none of these disciples had seen what he looked like after 3 months had passed. Early in the morning, the bells and drums in Great Wu's imperial palace rang, and all beasts roared. Wu Tianming had put on a grand ceremony to hold a court meeting. All the officials in Great Wu's capital, even the lowest-ranking ones, dressed in splendid robes, entered the palace, and the generals guarding the borders of Great Wu had rushed back to the capital today. All the civil and military officials were gathered in the hall, while the immortals and cultivators who had submitted to Great Wu in recent months, dressed in Taoist robes, lined up in Chichi under the leadership of Reverend White River. Today's Great Wu was a gathering of heroes and powerful soldiers. Sitting on the throne, Wu Tianming looked down at the courtiers in the great hall and square, feeling a sense of heroism bursting out of his heart. He could not help but believe that he was the only candidate for the new sacred emperor of the human race. As long as we have the help of the 3 imperial advisors, is it really that difficult to sit on that position? Wu Tianming rose to his feet slowly. The pressure of a gold immortal's divine sense spread out in all directions, and the purple gold aura around him overflowed. It was truly a domineering aura. All the civil and military officials, including the heaven immortals and cultivators who had pledged allegiance to him, knelt on the ground and paid their respects. The deafening voices filled Wu Tianming with a sense of ecstasy. He recalled the rumor circulating among the imperial families of the outer heavenly realms. It was said that if one could become the new sacred emperor of the human race, he would be able to ascend to godhood on behalf of the heavens, and even accumulate merits and virtues to ascend to the 33 heavens and be conferred the title of celestial emperor of the celestial court. From then on, he would be able to enjoy endless immortal blessings. How could the emperor of a small human kingdom compare to his power and influence? When did this rumor start? No one knew. But the rumor was extremely reliable, because the people from the immortal sects who helped train the soldiers and oracles of the outer heavenly realms all said so. Moreover, when the people of Great Wu moved to a certain heavenly realm, and on their way to Panga continent, the immortal monarchs of the celestial court also said the same thing. Since it was the immortal monarchs who said it, it must be true, right? First become the sacred emperor, then the celestial emperor. A bright future was right in front of him. Wu Tianming took a deep breath. Purple gold light and mist radiated from him, enveloping the entire capital like a small sun. The civil and military officials, immortals, and cultivators knelt on the ground even more respectfully, their foreheads pressed tightly against the ground for fear of offending him. Amidst the cries of cranes, 3 streams of clear air towered into the sky. From the imperial advisor's mansion on the side of the imperial palace, 3 huge chariots engraved with the patterns of wind, rain, thunder, and other natural phenomena soared into the sky, each pulled by 3 flood dragons with the cultivation base of heaven immortals. White clouds coiled around the chariot, forming an enormous cloud platform. 3,600 carefully selected handsome boys and girls, dressed in moon-white Taoist robes, stood neatly on either side of the chariot, holding long flagpoles made of pure gold and carrying flags of different colors. Their faces were glowing, and their faces were glowing. They proudly stood on both sides of the chariot, holding long flagpoles made of pure gold. These virgin boys and girls were all mortals. It was just that their looks were handsome and their aptitudes were extraordinary. However, they had Ding Jia talismans on their chests, Tai Chi talismans on their backs, dragon strength talismans on their waists, and 1,000 miles dashing talismans on their legs. All these talismans were drawn on their bodies by Giguzi with the blood essence of spirit creatures. Although these talismans were invisible to the naked eye, the power of these talismans alone gave these boys and girls a strength no weaker than ordinary body cultivators. However, they were mortals after all, and all their power came from these talismans. Even flying would consume their own energy, and if they were to fight with outsiders, they could only last for a quarter of an hour at most. They were not like real heaven immortals, who had an endless supply of energy and could replenish their energy by absorbing natural energies from the surroundings. The flags in their hands were 36 feet long and 2 feet and 4 inches wide. On them, Gigazi had drawn the images of stars with the blood of spirit creatures. Countless starry images fluttered in the wind, and from time to time, ripples of star power would stir up plumes of auspicious mist that lingered in all directions. In addition to the 3,600 boys and girls holding the flags, there were 360 handsome young men and women clad in Taoist robes standing before the chariot, clearing the way on clouds. These young men and women were the elite disciples carefully selected from the immortal sects that had recently submitted to them. Although their cultivation bases were not strong, their talents were very good. In Wu Qi's opinion, they all had the potential to break through the realm of gold immortals with their own efforts, even without the help of the 9 rotations pill. These immortal sects that came to Panga continent could be described with one word: poor. They were as poor as White Cloud Immortal Sect. These immortal sects were similar to the White Cloud Immortal Sect in the past. Although they were a huge sect, they only had 1 to 2 immortal items and 7 to 8 spirit items. Some of them were so poor that it made Wu Qi gnash his teeth. Although they were guarded by 7 or 8 heaven immortals, they did not even have a single immortal item, and even the few spirit items they had were trash that had been badly damaged after losing a fight. How could they still cultivate immortality when they were so poor? But, when these carefully selected young men and women showed up today, the eyes of the heaven immortals and cultivators in the Great Hall turned green. What did it mean to be covered in jewels? What did it mean to be shrouded in the aura of treasures? What did it mean to be a human-shaped magical artifact? Just look at these 360 lucky fellows. MOD had been very bored over the past 3 months, so he simply plundered a large number of materials from Great Wu's treasury and crafted a batch of heaven immortal items for these young cultivators. With MOD's current attainment in artifact crafting, the products he crafted were all first-grade heaven immortal items. Each young cultivator was armed to the teeth with flying swords, magical treasures, immortal robes, boots, hairpins, belts, and rings. Each of them was equipped with a full set of 36 immortal items, all of which were top-grade first-grade heaven immortal items. The immortals and cultivators standing in the Great Hall looked at the lucky juniors, who were surrounded by the aura of jewels and jewels. If they wandered the world alone, they would be the perfect targets for robbers and robbers. Looking at the tattered magic tools on their bodies, these people couldn't help but blush. Then, they became extremely excited. They suddenly realized that they had chosen a good backer. A power that could arm its new disciples with tens of thousands of heaven immortal items in 3 months was definitely a very promising one. If they followed Wu Qi, Gigazi, and MOD, they would all have a bright future ahead of them. Wu Qi's chariot landed in front of the Great Hall. Wu Tianming, Wu Dihao, and other important ministers of Great Wu came to greet them respectfully. In front of all the courtiers, immortals, and cultivators who had pledged allegiance to him, Wu Tianming bowed respectfully to Wu Qi and said, "Master, Uncle Masters, I'll need your help in this expedition." Wu Qi waved his hand casually, then slowly rose to his feet and got out of the chariot. With his hands clasped behind his back, he faced the sky at a 45-degree angle and said in a flat voice, "It's just a trivial matter. You can make your own decisions when marching and fighting. If you encounter an expert who blocks your way, it will be the time for us to strike." Gigazi said coldly and proudly, "All the disciples who have recently pledged allegiance must perform well. Depending on the merits you have rendered, we will take 300 of you into the inner sect and teach you the supreme magic of our sect. Work hard to assist Great Wu's emperor, and don't force us to deal with any random person." MOD, on the other hand, flicked his sleeve and shot out countless beams of light, flying toward the 2,000 heaven immortals, more than 10,000 nascent divinity cultivators, and tens of thousands of cultivators in the square. All the heaven immortals were given 3 first-grade heaven immortal items, all the nascent divinity cultivators were given 3 36-grade heaven immortal items, and all the cultivators below the nascent soul realm were given spirit items or ordinary magical treasures according to their cultivation base. Tens of thousands of immortals and cultivators cheered in unison, then fell to their knees respectfully and bowed to Mod. There were immortal sects in outer heavenly realms that were famous for their artifact refinement, but none of them could arm their disciples with more than 100,000 heaven immortal items at once. These heaven immortals and cultivators, armed by Mod with 100,000 heaven immortal artifacts, were more than enough to destroy any immortal sect that stood in their way, unless that immortal sect was guarded by a gold immortal. The rest of the immortal sects could not withstand a single blow. After the immortals were done kowtowing, Wu Tianming flew up into the sky, accompanied by Wu Qi and his companions. Looking down at Great Wu's subjects and the heaven immortals and cultivators who had pledged allegiance to Great Wu, he slowly raised his right hand. Great Wu shall rise, and I shall be the human emperor. My subjects, serve Great Wu with all your strength, and we shall share all the glory, splendor, and wealth. His words were brief, but powerful and bewitching. Everyone in the imperial city shouted, Great Wu shall rise, in unison. To his surprise, Wu Qi found that a strong power of faith was pouring into Wu Tianming's body, condensing into a pale purple aura that looked like a flood dragon in his body. Was this the emperor's aura? Wu Qi nodded slowly. This was the emperor's aura. During the court meeting, Wu Tianming issued dozens of edicts in a row. Dozens of Great Wu's generals commanded half of the army to stay at the southern end of the valley to guard against the invasion of foreign enemies. With Wu Dihao as the vanguard, the rest of Great Wu's army went out in full force to attack the other kingdoms, and Wu Tianming led the army himself. Chapter 939. Between the two mountains, a magnificent city blocked the way of Great Wu's army. The city wall, built entirely of black boulders, was 1,000 feet tall, half a mile thick, and 30 miles wide. It was densely surrounded by anti-flight arrays and other defensive formations of various sizes, completely cutting off Great Wu's army's passage from the Wu River Valley to the north. Beyond the city was the territory of the Chu state, a great power from the outer heavenly realms. As the sun set, a blood-red glow filled the sky, and a blood-red light shone in all directions. Everything was coated with a thick layer of blood. Hundreds of thousands of slave warriors were divided into 10,000-strong groups, and they kept charging towards the city wall like the rising tide. The anti-flight arrays prevented them from leaping into the air, so they could only rely on crude ladders and other siege weapons to fight for their lives. Arrows rained down from the top of the wall. A row of hundreds of oracles stood on top of the wall with their hands held high above their heads. Fireballs, about 10 feet in diameter, kept falling whistling down from their palms and exploding violently as soon as they hit the ground, enveloping everything within hundreds of feet in flames. From time to time, some soldiers were shot and fell to the ground, but they quickly pulled out the arrows, gritted their teeth, and roared as they charged toward the wall. From time to time, some soldiers were blown away by the fireballs, but they struggled to swing their weapons and charge toward the wall, their bodies shrouded in black smoke, ignoring the shredded flesh on their bodies. Groups of slave soldiers mixed with the attacking army with strong bows and crossbows, and from time to time straightened their bodies and fired dense volleys of arrows that blanketed a certain section of the wall. Some oracles were also mixed with the army, carefully dodging the arrows and fireballs falling from the top of the wall, and from time to time unleashing fireballs and lightning to attack their peers on the wall. At the same time, there were also slave soldiers who threw down their weapons and armors and fled. But before they could take a few steps, they heard a shrill whistle. The divine archers of Great Wu's supervisory team had mercilessly shot their specially made god-slaying arrows, which hit the soldiers in the head and shattered their souls in one fell swoop. The first wave of soldiers soon collapsed under the frenzied attack of the defenders on the wall, and the routed soldiers fled backward. Amidst the crazy curses and scoldings of the supervisors, the new wave of soldiers roared like wild beasts and rushed toward the wall at the top of their speed. Wave after wave, it continued without end, never ending. Great Wu's army of 3 million soldiers had set up a temporary battle formation in the valley. At the front of the neat and clean camp was the messy camp of the slave army. More than 200,000 slave soldiers were lying on the ground, absorbing Pangu's sacred energy at full speed to heal their wounds and restore their strength. These slave armies were called slave armies, but in fact, they were the garrisons of the cities that Great Wu had conquered since the northern expedition. All the garrisons were enslaved into the slave armies to serve as cannon fodder for Great Wu's siege. In the face of Great Wu's formidable army and excellent ordnance, these soldiers had no room to resist. They could only fight desperately, trying to kill the enemy and gain merit. If one was killed, he would be removed from the slave army and assigned to Great Wu's logistic army. If he killed 3, he would be removed from the logistic army and assigned to Great Wu's regular army. If he killed 10, he would become a citizen of Great Wu and be promoted to an officer. If he killed 100, he would be promoted to a general, and if he killed 1,000, he would be rewarded with a title of nobility. All the slave armies were originally soldiers of the Chu state. In just a month, Great Wu had conquered 37 cities of the Chu state and captured more than 600,000 soldiers and more than 2,000 oracles. Now, they were all incorporated into Great Wu's slave army and were serving Great Wu at the risk of their lives. When the 13th wave of soldiers collapsed, Wu Qi, who was watching the battle on a low hill behind Great Wu's supervisors, shook his head. Gigu Zi shook his head as well. The city's defense was extremely strong, and it was impossible for the slave armies to capture it. These slave armies were still of great use, and they could not be killed in vain under the wall. He grabbed a boulder beside him with his left hand, and a slate, about a foot in diameter, flew out of it. With a stream of immortal energy, Gigu Zi carved a few talismans on the slate and handed it to a boy standing next to him. The boy bowed and accepted the order. Holding the slate respectfully with both hands, he walked slowly toward the city wall a dozen miles away. A few other boys and girls followed closely behind him. There were a total of 12 boys and girls, which was the art of 6 ding and 6 jia. The talismans carved on their bodies were also made according to the art of 6 ding and 6 jia. Once they were gathered together, they would produce divine power. The 12 boys and girls moved as fast as the wind, and in just a few seconds, they had come less than 2 miles away from the city wall. The strange attire of these boys and girls alarmed the defenders on the wall. At the command of a general, 3 giant ballistae rattled and fired 36 bolts, each as thick as a fist and over 10 feet long, at the boys and girls. When the bolts, which were made of pure metal, were still hundreds of feet away from their targets, a thunderbolt came crashing down from the sky and exploded in front of the boys and girls. The bolts melted into molten iron and splashed all over the ground. The molten iron flew hundreds of feet away, but all the molten iron avoided the bodies of the boys and girls, and did not hurt a single hair on their heads. Gigu Zi stroked his beard and smiled reservedly. The 6 ding and 6 jia can protect us from all external evils. The essence of this talisman lies in how to connect the fate of these boys with the 6 ding and 6 jia deity. It sounds amazing, but it is actually very simple. Remember, when you draw the talisman, you only need to do this. The immortals and cultivators who stood beside the chariot, who were very interested in the art of divination and divination, listened attentively to Gigu Zi's lecture, lest they missed a word. To the immortals and cultivators from outer heavenly realms, gold immortals were legendary beings, and they could give up everything in order to become disciples of gold immortals. To these immortals and cultivators from outer heavenly realms, gold immortals were legendary creatures, and they could give up everything just to become disciples of gold immortals. The problem was that the gold immortals of outer heavenly realms were lofty existences, and they would never accept disciples at will. Every disciple was carefully selected, and some even had to go through more than a dozen reincarnations before they could be accepted as disciples. With the aptitude and background of these immortals and cultivators from small immortal sects, how could they be disciples of gold immortals? Now that Wu Qi and his companions had opened their doors and accepted disciples at will, these immortals and cultivators naturally flattered them wholeheartedly and listened to their teachings. The 12 boys, Chi-Chi, cupped their fists and bowed to the top of the wall, then recited an incantation at the same time. Suddenly, the slate in the first boy's hand flew up, turned into a hazy cloud of earth energy, and seeped into the ground and mountains around the wall. The earth quaked and the mountains shook as dense runes of restrictive formations burst out of the ground and mountains, disintegrating all the anti-flight formations and other formations in the city in an instant. With a slate, Gigu Z had forcibly reversed the path of the underground energy veins under the city, causing the natural energy to dissipate and easily breaking the city's defensive formation. With that, the invisible pressure within 100 miles of the city suddenly lightened. Over 2,000 heaven immortals and tens of thousands of cultivators of Great Wu flew up into the sky. Sword beams rained down like rain, forming a screen of light over the city. The soldiers in the city were in a mess. Dozens of heavily armored captains roared and leaped into the sky, smashing their weapons at the screen of light. Amidst a deafening boom, the weapons in the captains' hands broke, and the tremendous counterforce shook them to the ground, causing them to cough up blood. Dozens of dragon tendons, each as thick as a thumb, came whistling down. The translucent ropes, each with a blood-colored talisman at its head and tail, tied the captains up like rice dumplings. No matter how they struggled, they could not break free. There were still nearly 100,000 soldiers guarding the city. When they saw their superiors were captured alive by the enemy, they let out a war cry, and 70% of them opened the north gate and fled. The other 30% of soldiers, on the other hand, were extremely courageous. They picked up those heavy, giant crossbow bolts and other defensive equipment, then threw them into the air in a messy manner. However, the screen of light was composed of countless immortal swords. As soon as these attacks touched it, they were cut into pieces and fell to the ground. 37 pitch-black, 7-storied pagodas flew up into the sky. They quickly expanded to several miles tall and smashed heavily on the plain outside the north gate like 37 hills. Great Wu's supreme oracles in black robes stood at the top of each pagoda. They looked disdainfully at the fleeing soldiers, performed an incantation gesture at the same time, and then stretched their hands forward. 37 small shooting stars, each tens of feet in diameter, fell straight down along with ear-piercing swishing noises. Fiery light splashed in all directions, while milky white shockwaves rolled up the fiery light and pieces of rocks, darting out in all directions. Nearly 10,000 soldiers were turned into ashes by this attack, and another 20,000 soldiers who rushed at the front were swept away by the shockwaves, having their bones and tendons broken by the broken rocks. Wu Qi, who was watching the battle from the rear, cried out in a deep voice, "What a bunch of wastrels! Your Majesty, Great Wu's oracles need to be taught a lesson." 13,799 soldiers were killed. 13,799 slave soldiers. They could have cost Great Wu at least thousands of elites. How could they kill them all at once? Wu Tianming looked at the supreme oracles with a displeased expression and said coldly, "I'll leave this to my master. They really need to be trained well." Unaware that they had been handed over to Wu Qi by Wu Tianming, the 37 supreme oracles stood triumphantly on top of the pagodas, looking coldly at the Chu soldiers who were kneeling on the plain. Deafening battle cries rang out from behind. Great Wu's elite soldiers had rushed into the city, and with the help of the cultivators, they were killing and capturing the soldiers who blocked their way. Before long, soldiers in Great Wu's armor rushed out of the north gate and surrounded the tens of thousands of surrendered soldiers. The capital of Chu State was just ahead of them. Great Wu's army of 3 million soldiers and hundreds of thousands of slave soldiers charged forward like a ferocious dragon, and it took them only half a day to wipe out Chu State, where most of its soldiers had been captured. Then, with Chu State as the base, Great Wu's army divided into 3 groups, each led by Wu Qi, Gigu Z, and Mod. The 3 armies swept across the land, wiping out 87 states in just 1 year. Great Wu's northern border was now connected to Nu Yu's southern border. The vanguard of the army led by Mod clashed with Nu Yu's garrison, and in just the space of a few breaths, 3,000 vanguard soldiers of Great Wu were wiped out by 10 patrols from Nu Yu. Chapter 940. The setting sun was as red as blood, turning the mountains and rivers red. 3,000 elite soldiers of Great Wu were lying neatly on the ground in the wide valley. They were marching, but before they could deploy their battle formations, they were killed. They fell back neatly, each with a sword in the neck, leaving only a trace of skin to keep them from being decapitated. Blood flowed all over the ground, and the river, which was about a mile wide, was dyed red by human blood. Wu Renren, clad in heavy armor and holding a spear, looked in despair at the 10 soldiers of Nu Yu who were slowly approaching him. Clad in tight grass-green leather armor, their footsteps were extremely light, and they made no sound as they walked. They were like devils from hell, and as soon as they appeared, they started a massacre. From the front of the vanguard led by Wu Renren to the back of the procession, all 3,000 elite soldiers of Great Wu were killed in less than 2 breaths of time before they could see their enemies clearly. The dozens of soldiers at the back of the procession had just drawn their weapons, and the soldiers at the front did not even have the time to do so before they were killed by the 10 fearsome scouts. Wu Renren was the son of Wu Dihao, the former regent of Great Wu, whose cultivation base had reached the peak of the 9 stars realm of the first Panga heaven. In order for him to make more military contributions, Wu Dihao had specially assigned him to lead the vanguard to explore the way ahead. Great Wu's army had wiped out dozens of kingdoms along the way like a hot knife through butter, so Wu Renren could not help but feel a little complacent when he marched. But the 10 fearsome soldiers in front of him had completely wiped out that trace of complacency in his heart. In front of them, Great Wu's invincible army was nothing but a joke. His mount, the Blue Lion, was so frightened by the strong killing intent emanating from the scouts that it lay on the ground obediently, refusing to move no matter how Wu Renren kicked it. Wu Renren held the spear tremblingly, but he could not bring himself to fight these people. The gap in strength was too great. Each of these scouts had the cultivation base of the first star realm of the second Panga heaven. Was this the source of Nu Yu's confidence by using soldiers with the strength of gold immortals as scouts? Wu Renren really wanted to cry. Great Wu did have soldiers of the second Panga heaven, but not only were they few in number, they were all kept by Wu Tianming as strategic reserves. But these soldiers in front of him were just scouts, just scouts. How could they have the overall strength of the second Panga heaven? A Nu Yu scout grabbed Wu Renren's spear and forcibly snatched it from his hand. Curiously, the scout chopped the spear with his sword. The spear was forged by Mod himself, and it was made for a general of Great Wu's imperial clan like Wu Renren. Naturally, it was made of the finest materials. As a weapon of upper-grade gold immortal artifact, how could it be broken by the standard weapon in the soldier's hand? A muffled sound rang out. There wasn't even the slightest trace of a mark on the spear, while the scout's long and thin sword, which was specially made for scouts, was directly broken into more than 10 pieces. Nu Yu's scouts cried out in surprise, a superb divine weapon. These scouts looked at Wu Renren with the strange gaze of a tiger looking at a little lamb. They pounced on Wu Renren and quickly tied him up. The military system of Deyu was extremely rigid. One was given a weapon according to one's strength, and even the kings of Deyu's imperial clan could not violate this rule. Wu Renren's spear was of very high quality, but his cultivation base was not very high in the eyes of these soldiers. Given such a superb divine weapon with such a poor cultivation base, this fellow must have a very high status. Happily, the scouts tied Wu Renren up like a rice dumpling, lifted him up with his spear, and ran upstream along the river valley. At the mouth of the river, a small Nu Yu military town came into view. It was garrisoned with only 100 soldiers. For Nu Yu, a military town with 100 soldiers was more symbolic than practical. It was nothing more than the fact that it was the southernmost border of Nu Yu, and Nu Yu had stationed some soldiers here to declare its ownership. In fact, the nearest city to this military town was more than 2,000 miles away. Apart from some official herb gatherers and hunters, who would come here for no reason. 10 scouts brought Wu Renren back to the military town, shouting the words, "Urgent military intelligence." The soldiers in the town, who were so bored that they would knock their heads against mountains, suddenly became restless. One by one, they put on their helmets and armors and rushed out with weapons in hand. All of them, including the 100-man lieutenant, had their eyes gleaming fiercely, wishing that a group of enemies would show up right now and let them kill them for fun. In the valley, the river flowed downstream with blood. A dozen miles behind the vanguard led by Wu Renren, Wu Dihao's army was resting in the valley. The soldiers were fetching water from the river, making a fire to cook, or watering the animals and mounts that followed the army. Suddenly, a large amount of blood was washed down from upstream. Although the blood had become extremely thin after being washed for tens of miles, these soldiers had sharp eyes and ears, and their 5 senses were extremely sharp. They immediately smelled the strong smell of blood in the river. It was not only the smell of blood, but also the smell of human blood. The news was immediately reported to Wu Dihao. Greatly alarmed, he immediately sent someone to pass the military intelligence to MOD, who was leading the middle corps in the rear. Then, he took a dozen of his trusted generals, mounted their mounts, and went forward to investigate along the valley. Tens of thousands of soldiers whistled and left their tents and supplies to their allies in the rear. Then, they picked up their weapons and quickly marched forward. In just a dozen miles, Wu Dihao soon came to the place where the 3,000 vanguard soldiers were killed. 3,000 elite soldiers of Great Wu were lying neatly on the ground in Chichi, as if someone had carefully arranged their bodies. Each of them had been stabbed in the neck with a sword, and it was this sword that had completely wiped out their life force. The difference in strength was so great that the 3,000 soldiers were killed before they could fight back. The enemy's strength was extremely amazing. The only thing to be thankful for was that the body of his beloved son, Wu Renren, was not found. Clearly, he was captured alive, but it was better than being killed. Wu Dihao glanced at Wu Renren's blue lion, who was paralyzed on the ground and could not move, and growled, "Incompetent trash, do you think I need you to use me?" The blue lion howled miserably and was kicked dozens of miles away by Wu Dihao. Its internal organs were shattered, and it could not be more dead. Get ready to fight. Wu Dihao clenched the top-grade gold immortal spear in his hand while riding on his green-scaled horned horse. Tens of thousands of Great Wu's soldiers were galloping forward with heavy, uniform footsteps. 2 supreme oracles with 7-storied pagodas hovered over their heads and blessed them with the only 3 talismans they knew: spiritual defense, defense strengthening, and morale boosting. Led by Wu Dihao, tens of thousands of soldiers rushed toward the end of the valley like a dark cloud. In just a quarter of an hour, they had surrounded the small plain at the end of the valley, which measured about 2,000 feet in circumference and housed only 100 Nuyu soldiers. At first glance, Wu Dihao saw his son stripped naked, tied up, and hung on a flagpole at the south gate of the military town. He glanced at the town and saw only 100 soldiers and 2 oracles without pagodas. The 2 oracles were waving their hands and pulling out bone talismans to bless the soldiers with various defensive spells. Wu Dihao sneered and cried out in a low voice, "How ridiculous! You don't know the immensity of heaven and earth." With Wu Dihao's cultivation base, he naturally looked down on the weak strength of the Nuyu soldiers in the town. He pointed the spear forward and cried out in a deep voice, "Which general will capture this place for me? I'll consider it a great merit." Before Great Wu's generals could make their move, the 2 supreme oracles who accompanied the army had already flown toward the town with great pride and used their most powerful magic, meteor summoning. 2 meteors, each hundreds of feet in circumference, shot down from the sky and plunged straight toward the center of the town. At the same time, one of the supreme oracles waved a hand, and Wu Renren, who was hung on the flagpole, swayed and was dragged by a great force to the side of the supreme oracle. 2 thunderous booms rang out as 2 dark shadows tore through the void. The only 2 supreme oracles under Wu Dihao's command howled miserably as they looked down at their bodies in disbelief. There was a hole the size of a wash basin in their chests, and a strange force was frantically devouring their life force. Before they could come up with a way to save their lives, the strange curse had strangled their fire of life, turning their bodies into 2 puddles of stinky water that sprinkled down from the sky. 2 7-storied pagodas fell heavily to the ground, and the 2 supreme oracles were killed by the enemy before they could even activate them to protect themselves. On top of the wall, the lieutenant of the town looked at the oracle next to him in surprise. Are they stupid? How dare they get within 10 miles of Nuyu's town without any protection? Do they really think our god-slaying crossbows are just for show? The lieutenant scratched his head in confusion and said, "They are oracles, and they should stay in the rear of the army to provide support to the army. Even supreme oracles rarely rush to the front line. Why did they rush to our town to die? What are they plotting? What's their trick? Can anyone help me figure out what they are plotting? Is it some kind of vicious curse? All the soldiers and the two oracles in the town stared at each other, and no one could answer the question of their immediate superior. Wu Dihao almost threw the spear out of his hand, and his heart was twitching. Great Wu only had about 30 supreme oracles, and 2 of them were killed just like that. 2 of them were killed just like that. Wu Renren's death was not a big deal. After all, Wu Dihao had more than 100 children. But there were only about 30 supreme oracles in the whole of Great Wu. Attack! Attack the city! Attack! Wu Dihao trembled with anger, and without hesitation, he gave the order to attack the city. In a situation where neither side knew the other, Great Wu and New Yu had their first large-scale, but also small-scale, collision. For Great Wu, this was a large-scale battle. For New Yu, well, the situation here was not even qualified to be put on the desk of the Emperor of New Yu, who was also King Xian Shan. Nearly 100,000 soldiers of Great Wu were besieging a town garrisoned by 100 men, and the battle had begun. Chapter 941. High up in the sky, Wu Qi, Gigu Zi, and Mod, who had just arrived after hearing the news, stood on a white cloud and looked down at the ground. Right below them was the military town garrisoned by 100 men. Nearly 100,000 Great Wu soldiers had surrounded the small town, and the first wave of 1,000 soldiers was launching an attack from the east of the town. The town had a unique style of Diyu. Although it was only a small town garrisoned by 100 men, it was built on a mountain. To the west were hills extending from the mountain range, which made it difficult for the army to deploy. To the north and south were extremely steep slopes, which allowed the enemy to amass a large number of soldiers, but it was extremely stupid to attack from the north and south. No one would be stupid enough to attack from these 2 directions. To the east was a fan-shaped plain, with the narrowest part just under the eastern wall. It was no more than 200 feet wide, and the widest part was a dozen miles wide, enough to accommodate tens of thousands of soldiers. The strange terrain meant that even if the enemy sent tens of thousands of soldiers to attack from the east at once, the attacking area would only be 200 feet long when they reached the bottom of the wall. In terms of terrain, this military town was easy to defend and difficult to attack. The various defensive facilities of the military town were also well organized and flawless. Diyu was traditional, conservative, stubborn, and rigid. But, because of this conservative tradition, which was as stinky and hard as a stone in a latrine pit, there was no such thing as a shoddy construction in Diyu. The small military town, which was only garrisoned by 100 men, had all the necessary defensive measures. There were restrictive formations that could make it difficult for even gold immortals to fly, and restrictive formations hidden hundreds of miles underground, all of which had greatly weakened the strength of the attacking army. The 200 feet tall wall made the little military town look like a bunker. It was so small, yet so tall, that it gave people a sense of uneasiness. The wall was about 10 feet thick, and its base was nearly 50 feet thick. It was made of huge mountain rocks melted with molten iron, and each boulder was carved with complicated runes and restrictive spells. Like the other cities in Great Yu, this little military town was connected to several underground energy veins. Through these energy veins, it was connected to the mountains and rivers within tens of thousands of miles around, and had summoned countless mountain spirits and water demons to strengthen it with the power of ghosts and deities. Therefore, if an external force wanted to shake this military town, it would have to destroy the mountains and rivers within tens of thousands of miles, and kill all the mountain spirits and water demons hiding in them in one fell swoop. However, all of the defensive mechanisms under this small military town were only a part of the defensive mechanisms of the city 2,000 miles away, and the defensive mechanisms under that city, which housed hundreds of thousands of people, were also a part of the defensive mechanisms of a large military town tens of thousands of miles away. Ring after ring, countless small restrictive spells formed a large-scale restrictive spell, and countless such large-scale restrictive spells were fed back to the provincial capital of each province and county, turning into the restrictive spells of the entire province and county. All the military towns and cities in Diyu were built in such a rigid manner, and all the facilities were built according to a unified standard handed down by their ancestors. The small 100-army town in front of them was like a solid iron nail that was firmly nailed here. Then, Gigazi explained in detail to Wu Qi and Mod the various defensive mechanisms of this military town, as well as the truth of the formation map. Nothing could hide from Gigazi's reverse analysis of those small formations that were hidden deep underground, or even several thousand miles deep into the underground energy veins. There was nothing mysterious about the huge nested defensive mechanisms in his eyes. Even though some of them were the patterns secretly passed down from the Directorate of Celestials in Diyu, he was able to analyze them one by one with his current attainment in the art of formations and formations. Mod frowned and said, "If that's the case, if this little military town were to attack with all its might, Great Wu's army would be in danger of being defeated?" Wu Qi nodded his head slowly and said, "As long as the lieutenant of this military town is not an idiot, relying on the defensive mechanisms of this town and the powerful weapons they are equipped with, they do have the chance to defeat this army of several tens of thousands of soldiers." "Ha, didn't those two supreme oracles get shot as soon as they met?" "That's good," Gigu-zi said grimly. "The conservative forces in Great Wu are still against the three of us, so let Nu Yu teach them a lesson for us. That way, we can win the hearts of Great Wu's people, which is a good thing." Wu Qi narrowed his eyes and laughed. "That's right." Although Wu Dihao had been forced to hand over his power as the regent, and was still loyally helping Wu Tianming in his conquest, one could not judge a man's heart from his face. Unless Wu Qi captured his soul and interrogated it, who could know what he was thinking? Also, there were those fake supreme oracles in Great Wu. They did not have much ability, but their tempers were worse than anyone else's. Even though they knew that Wu Qi had killed 8 supreme oracles of the same cultivation base as them, they only thought that Wu Qi's sneak attack from behind was an unfair victory. They were still arrogant and did not know their place in the imperial court. In particular, they had many disciples and grand disciples, and many powerful clans that had submitted to them. With Wu Qi's current status, he had to give in to them in some matters. After all, Wu Qi did not want to rule Great Wu by violent means, as that would be too high profile. What he wanted was to influence Great Wu in a reasonable way, just to influence, not to control. He wanted to use Nu Yu's power to teach the conservative forces in Great Wu a hard lesson, to make them understand that without Wu Qi, they could not do anything. This was a good result. If he could also kill a few supreme oracles, princes, and the like in Great Wu's imperial court, he would be happy to do it. Wu Qi would not be sad for the 2 dead supreme oracles, and he would only applaud and cheer. Just as Wu Qi and the others were talking and laughing in low voices, the first wave of Great Wu's soldiers who attacked the military town was less than 1,000 feet from the city wall. On top of the wall, an oracle raised his hands and recited an incantation in a low voice. Suddenly, the section of wall on the east side of the town began to wriggle like a living thing. Then, a vivid ghost head appeared on the wall. The huge and ferocious ghost head opened its mouth and swallowed forward. A plume of black smoke poured out of it, wrapped up the 3,000 soldiers, and pulled them into it. Shrill howls kept coming out of the black smoke, and the sound of chewing could be heard coming from under the ground. In the blink of an eye, the first wave of soldiers, along with some siege weapons such as ladders, were wiped out. The ghost head twisted and wriggled, and faint roars of struggle could be heard coming out of it. All of a sudden, a sword tore open the ghost head's mouth and poked its way out. Next to Wu Dihao, a general with a cultivation base of the 3 stars realm of the second Pangu heaven staggered out of the ghost head. Then, he howled miserably as the ghost head sucked him back into its mouth. The sound of bones breaking kept ringing out. The ghost head was the manifestation of the power of the ghost god from the mountains and rivers tens of thousands of miles around. Every time it chewed, it was as if all the mountains and rivers within tens of thousands of miles were pressing down on its body, and after being strengthened by formations and restrictive spells, it was several times more powerful than before. Despite the general's amazing cultivation base, he could not withstand the attack of this level. He struggled for a moment, and then was eaten up by the ghost head. Wu Dihao flew into a rage. With a wave of his hand, 8 of his trusted generals rushed out of the formation at the same time and cried out loudly. More than 10,000 of his most elite soldiers fell into formation at the same time. They lined up in the real rectangular formation of Chi-Chi and rushed toward the eastern wall of the military town like a raging black tide. The few generals with the highest cultivation bases around Wu Dihao rushed to the forefront of the formation, holding the evil-repelling talismans made by Great Wu's supreme oracle in front of them as they charged forward fearlessly. When they were about 1,000 feet away from the town, 2 New Yu oracles on the wall waved their hands at the same time. A rumble came from under the ground, and the bodies of the charging generals swayed. Their legs gave way, and a bright light flashed before their eyes. In the blink of an eye, they were teleported to God knows where by the town's restrictive spell. When they opened their eyes, what appeared in front of them was a magnificent city with walls hundreds of miles long and armored soldiers. 18 dark supreme towers were hovering over the suffocating city. 18 supreme oracles and tens of thousands of New Yu soldiers on the city walls were looking in surprise at the few brave, powerful, and courageous generals of Great Wu. The military town built by De Yu was connected to underground energy veins, which were more or less connected to each other. Just like the Kuafu chasing the sun's step that Wu Qi had comprehended himself, the restrictive spell outside the town could teleport a small group of enemies to other places through the energy veins, such as the current capital of New Yu, the city of Yuxiong. If Great Wu had qualified oracles who were proficient in all kinds of magic and curses with the army, they could have helped the army resist this bizarre restrictive spell, and the few powerful generals around Wu Dihao would not have been sent away so easily. Unfortunately, the 2 strongest supreme oracles around Wu Dihao had been killed because of greed, and the rest of the oracles knew nothing about New Yu's defenses. How could they have the strength to help Great Wu's army attack the enemy? The generals who led the charge disappeared strangely in front of everyone, and the tens of thousands of elite soldiers around Wu Dihao rushed straight toward the wall. The ghost head on the wall reappeared, and more than 5,000 soldiers were swallowed in one gulp. 2 New Yu oracles on the wall twisted and broke a bone staff made of a human thigh bone at the same time, and a bizarre soul shock swept out in all directions. The few oracles standing around Wu Dihao were stunned, while scores of Great Wu's soldiers fell stiffly to the ground. Their souls were torn out of their bodies and quickly sucked into the transmigration. Like the oracles of the other human kingdoms in outer heavenly realms, Great Wu's oracles did not have a systematic and comprehensive study of all kinds of talismans and spells. In the face of the bizarre soul attacks of New Yu's oracles, they were at a loss. They had no idea what their opponents were doing. The superficial defensive spells they had cast could not stop the spells unleashed by the 2 oracles in the town with their powerful magical artifacts. Tens of thousands of Great Wu's soldiers were killed, and only Wu Dihao, whose cultivation base was extremely strong and whose soul had fused with a beast's soul, and dozens of oracles who followed the army survived. They stood alone in front of the town, their bodies stiff and their eyes dull as they stared at the little town. Their minds were blank, and they could not think of anything else. The corner of Wu Qi's mouth twitched into a faint smile. Suddenly, a Tower of Babel appeared in the sky above the military town. Chapter 942. An old man as thin as a match squatted at the top of the supreme tower, his eyes gleaming with a green light, squinting at the corpses of Great Wu's soldiers all over the ground. "You've done a good job, you little bastards. These fools are useless. How dare they provoke New Yu with such little strength?" The old man's voice was hoarse and gruesome, unpleasant to the ear. Wu Dihao felt a burning sensation in his lower abdomen, and he barely clamped his legs together to prevent himself from peeing on the spot. He stared in horror at the old man squatting at the top of the supreme tower, and an instinctive sense of despair and fear almost made him pass out. This was the instinctive feeling of a lower-grade living being toward a superior enemy. As soon as Wu Dihao saw the old man, he knew that he could easily crush him with a finger. Wu Dihao did not have such a feeling in front of Great Wu's original supreme oracles. It was said that those great oracles had the same overall strength as the supreme oracles on Panga continent, but when Wu Dihao saw a real supreme oracle with his own eyes, he realized that it was nonsense. Even if 10 of Great Wu's supreme oracles joined forces, they would not necessarily be able to defeat a real supreme oracle. Wu Dihao's instinct told him that if these supreme oracles from outer heavenly realms met this old man, they would only be lambs to be slaughtered. "Retreat! Retreat!" Wu Dihao howled hoarsely. Ignoring his son who was hanging on the flagpole on the city wall, he slapped his green-scaled wildebeest's rump and urged it to leap into a blue cloud and retreat to the rear. Behind them were hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and MOD, the imperial advisor, was in charge. Wu Dihao suddenly missed MOD's rigid face so much that he wished he could hide under MOD's wings and shiver. Maybe the imperial advisor can defeat this terrible old man. Wu Dihao suddenly felt that some of the little thoughts in his mind were so stupid that they were ridiculous. He had extinguished all fighting spirit now. His intuition told him that only the three imperial advisors, who called themselves Slaughter and Wolf, could lead Great Wu to the peak. He could not, Wu Tianming could not, and no one in Great Wu's imperial court could not. This supreme oracle in front of him had the strength to disintegrate the whole Great Wu. He. Since you're already here, why run? The old man squatting on top of the Tower of Babel lowered his head and said to the guards standing solemnly in the military town, "Little guys, you've done well. The 100-men lieutenant guarding this place will be promoted to 1,000-men lieutenant. There will be an official document sent later to expand this military town by 10 times, heh." With a flick of his sleeve, several heads flew toward the fleeing Wu Dihao with a whistling sound. Their heads were dripping with blood, grimacing in pain as they died with their eyes wide open. They were the unlucky ones who had led the charge and were teleported to the front of Yuxiong City. It was because of their unexpected appearance that the Emperor of Nuyu, who presided over the city of Yuxiong, had sent Suiren Feng, the supreme oracle of Suiren clan, to find out what was going on here. Wu Dihao, who was running fast on his green-scaled horned horse, was hit by the heads, which exploded into 7 or 8 clumps of blood behind him. The sticky blood with wisps of fire stuck to his back and made his flesh crackle as it burned. Wu Dihao howled in pain. He lay prone on his horse for a while, but the pain was so great that his internal organs were twitching and oily because of the strange fire. Unable to bear the terrible pain, he fell off the back of his mount, twitching all over. The oracles who followed him were not in the mood to rescue him. Instead, they sped away on gusts of chilly wind toward the military camp in the distance. Behind them, the supreme Tower of Babel was approaching silently. Laughing strangely, Suiren Feng said, "Interesting, interesting. How dare you abandon your commander and flee? In Nuyu, doing so is a crime punishable by the death of your entire clan." With a wave of his hand, a huge hand condensed from flames grabbed toward Wu Dihao. Suiren Feng looked carelessly into the distance. Just a dozen miles away, the military camp under MOD's command could be seen clearly. The murderous aura emanating from the drill of hundreds of thousands of soldiers towered into the sky and turned into a dense cloud of black smoke. Amidst the thick black smoke, a bear could be vaguely seen lying down. It was an army of elite soldiers. Suiren Feng looked at the bear in surprise, then quickly sent his divine sense into the camp. If all these elite soldiers had the overall strength of Nuyu soldiers, it would be a big blow to Nuyu. But, the feedback from his divine sense made him breathe a sigh of relief. These soldiers' murderous aura, killing intent, and courage were top-notch, but their cultivation bases were still inferior to Nuyu's soldiers. Useless chickens and stray dogs. Laughing evilly, Suiren Feng grabbed Wu Dihao with a huge hand of fire and burned his skin and flesh. Sparkling, translucent yellow human oil slowly dripped out of his body. It was Suiren Feng's favorite human withering fire, which was specially used to torture people. It could burn out all the oil and water in a human body, but still keep the person alive. It was a very cruel and vicious evil art. Wu Dihao's internal organs felt as if they were being boiled in hot oil. He opened his mouth and tried to cry for help, but all his cries turned into wisps of water vapor. Suiren Feng trembled with excitement. He gritted his teeth and continued to train Wu Dihao's body, slowly extracting the oil and water drop by drop. Wu Dihao was the only one here, but there were hundreds of thousands of soldiers waiting for him in the distance. The Emperor of Nuyu had only sent him out to find out the details of the military situation, but he could still be considered meritorious if he destroyed an army. At the thought of the spectacular scene of hundreds of thousands of people being turned into a lake of oil by him, Suiren Feng felt refreshed. With so much human oil, the extremely evil mystic art he was cultivating, which was strictly forbidden in Yu's Directorate of Celestials, should be able to be upgraded to a higher level, right? Perhaps, his cultivation base could be upgraded to a higher level. Just as Sui Ren Feng threw his head back and laughed excitedly, a furious roar rang out of the void. Abandoning your commander and fleeing in the face of battle is a crime worthy of death. The three imperial advisors of Great Wu, Wu Qi, Gigu, Zi, and Mod, flew down from the sky. A white sword beam shot out of Wu Qi's hand and cut down the dozens of fleeing oracles who had abandoned Wu Dihao. Wu Dihao, who was badly burned by the human withering fire, growled hoarsely, "Well done. Damn you. Help me, imperial advisors. I'm willing to be your disciple, and I have no other thoughts." Wu Qi arched an eyebrow. Sure enough, this guy has other thoughts. TSK, judging by your fat and strong appearance, it doesn't matter if you lose some oil. I'm not in a hurry to save you. Just consider it the price you have to pay for your little trick. Glancing sideways at Wu Dihao, who was struggling in the flaming hand, Wu Qi cupped his fist at Sui Ren Feng and said proudly, "Fellow Taoist, please release my imperial uncle." Sui Ren Feng snorted coldly and did not even bother to look at Wu Qi and his companions. They were just 3 peak-level gold immortals, not worthy of his attention at all. However, it was better to be safe than sorry. Sui Ren Feng activated the defensive mechanism on the Supreme Tower, which emitted a beam of strong black light that enveloped him. With that, Wu Qi and his companions could no longer hurt him with surprise attacks. The oracles of Yu were not like those fake supreme oracles of Great Wu who had their eyes on their foreheads. Any oracle of Yu would properly protect himself before a battle, never giving the enemy any chance to take advantage of him. Wu Dihao cried out again, "Help me, imperial advisor. I'm willing to be your disciple and listen to your teachings day and night." As an adult, he burst into tears. The shadow of death was pressing down on his heart, and the boundless fear had completely broken him down. All he wanted now was to stay alive, and he could not care about anything else. What were things like face and dignity worth in the face of his life? Wu Qi smiled. This time, he could finally see what Yu's Supreme Oracle was capable of. Sui Ren Feng did not take the 3 of them seriously, and Wu Qi did not want to waste time talking to him. Seeing that Wu Dihao was really about to collapse, Wu Qi let out a long roar. The sword on his back flew out, turned into 3 beams of sword energy that looked like white dragons, and slashed down at Sui Ren Feng's head. Gigu Zi murmured an incantation while holding the peachwood sword and circulating his energy above the cloud. His incantation sounded like the sound waves of countless locusts, gradually sweeping across the surrounding mountains and rivers. A muffled rumble rang out, and at the same time, thick earth and mist sprayed out of the mountains visible to the naked eye. Following the direction Gigu Zi's peachwood sword pointed at, the mist turned into dozens of huge yellow airwaves that slapped down at Sui Ren Feng's head. Mod, on the other hand, simply flicked his sleeve. A giant metal puppet, about 1,000 feet tall and shining with a dazzling light, swung its huge fist at Sui Ren Feng's Supreme Tower. Sui Ren Feng laughed, shook his head, and sighed. It's just a small trick. Sui Ren Feng could not hang on any longer. Wu Qi's sword energy tore through Sui Ren Feng's protective black light and brushed past his face. One of Sui Ren Feng's ears was cut off by Wu Qi, and a pale green liquid slowly gushed out of the wound. Before Sui Ren Feng could come up with a countermeasure, the spiritual energy of the earth veins Gigu Zi had channeled turned into 12 huge Ding Jia talismans and landed lightly on the Supreme Tower. A deafening rumble rang out, and the light barrier around Sui Ren Feng's Supreme Tower fluctuated violently. He could not even control the tower at will. Sui Ren Feng cried out in horror. The power Wu Qi and his companions used was definitely at the level of gold immortals, but their attacks were so exquisite that they seemed to have targeted all the flaws in Sui Ren Feng's defensive barrier. It was as if a slight move would cause a chain reaction. With the magic power of gold immortals, they had broken through Sui Ren Feng's supreme primordial defensive barrier. Before Sui Ren Feng could figure out what was going on, Mod's metal puppet had already punched the Supreme Tower. With a loud clang, the supreme tower was knocked flying away. Sui Ren Feng hovered alone in midair, staring dumbfoundedly at Wu Qi and his companions, who had approached him. Wu Qi grabbed Sui Ren Feng's skinny neck with one hand and put the flying sword against his neck. "Now, we can have a good talk." When Wu Qi said those words, his gesture was not like that of a true immortal, but more like that of a gangster collecting protection fees on the street. Sui Ren Feng's eyes flickered with a sinister light. He was about to teach Wu Qi a lesson when the sharp pain in his groin made him forget all the incantations in an instant. Wu Qi struck Sui Ren Feng's groin with his knee, turning him into a docile captive. Chapter 943. From the mouth of Sui Ren Feng, who was captured alive, Great Wu's emperor and courtiers finally understood what a colossus they were facing. Even though Nu Yu, which had split from Diyu, was less than half as strong as Diyu, it was a terrible existence that the human kingdoms in outer heavenly realms could not deal with. After all, Diyu was a great power that had fought alone against the Celestial Court and the Buddhist League for countless years. On the other hand, human kingdoms like Great Wu were just insignificant existences in outer heavenly realms, and everything they had was controlled by the immortal sects, large and small. Those immortal sects, on the other hand, were just insignificant pawns under the control of the Celestial Court, and they could not even be considered as the peripheral power of the Celestial Court. Finally understanding the gap between Great Wu and Nu Yu, at Wu Qi's suggestion, Great Wu gave up and retreated as quickly as they had come. All the people of human kingdoms along the way were forced to migrate further south. Great Wu gave up the northern expedition and shifted its focus to the east and west. There were more human kingdoms from outer heavenly realms there, and he could defeat the armies of those kingdoms and abduct their people to develop Great Wu's own army. According to Wu Qi's strategy, if Great Wu could conquer more than 30% of the human kingdoms in outer heavenly realms, it would at least have the power to protect itself from the attack of Diyu and Nu Yu. Under the powerful deterrent of Nu Yu, the whole of Great Wu began to move according to Wu Qi's will. Expand the army, expand the army, expand the army, advance, advance. Great Wu began to deploy troops to the east and west at the same time, like a ferocious monster that was growing larger and larger, devouring the human kingdoms that were also from outer heavenly realms. At the same time, at the border of the eastern region controlled by Dong Hai, Princess Zhanglu was inspecting the military towns and cities surrounded by a large group of people. Over the past few months, there had always been some conflicts, big and small. Sometimes the East Sea Army killed the enemy with ease, but sometimes it was the East Sea Army that suffered a little loss. On such a long border, at least 1,000 conflicts broke out every day, and more than 2,000 soldiers of the East Sea had died in the conflicts. It was not a good sign. Wu Qi could send intelligence back to the East Sea at any time, so the East Sea had a good understanding of the situation in outer heavenly realms. It was impossible for those small human kingdoms in outer heavenly realms to pose any threat to the East Sea. Take Great Wu for example. Could it cause any real damage to Nu Yu? But now, it was true that the East Sea was losing soldiers. This could only prove that outside the area controlled by the East Sea Army, in the boundless far east of Pangu continent, a new power had emerged, and this power was strong enough to pose a certain threat to the East Sea. Perhaps other powerful forces had intervened. They had the strength and courage to keep probing the East Sea. The Celestial Court had promised not to take the initiative to attack the East Sea, but in addition to the Celestial Court, there was also the behemoth Buddhist League. Furthermore, even the heavens didn't know how reliable the Heavenly Court's guarantee was. Who could guarantee that it was not some conspiracy of the Celestial Court? On the wall of a military town garrisoned with 3,000 soldiers, Princess Zhanglu looked to the east. It was a vast grassland with a wide expanse of flat land. Less than 100 miles away, a city that had been built just 2 months ago was in sight. It was so large that it could accommodate millions of residents. Now, a large group of people was opening up fields and building houses around the city, as if they were going to build a cluster of villages and towns around the city. Within the coverage of Princess Zhongli's divine will, within a radius of several thousand miles, tens of millions of people were bustling about. On the west gate of the city, a huge flag was hung on a very tall flagpole. Not to mention Princess Xianglu, even the soldiers with higher cultivation base in the military town could see the huge flag on the 3 miles tall flagpole, which had a huge purple character, "Spirit," written on it. The flagpole was 3 miles tall, and it looked so arrogant and domineering. It was very similar to the watchtower that Wu Qi had built outside the Lu Bang's gate years ago. Obviously, the huge character, "Spirit," was written by a great master. It was written in a lively and powerful style, like a huge dragon hovering over the flag, giving off an insufferably arrogant and threatening aura. "Spirit?" Princess Xianglu frowned and asked, "Is there any information about which human kingdom this represents?" Yan Bugui shook his head. Over the past 2 months, he had lost thousands of spies, a greater loss than the soldiers who died in the battles in the border military towns. For some unknown reason, the Far East region, which was once like a sieve that allowed the spies of the East Sea to come and go freely, had now become a dangerous trap. Once the spies of the East Sea entered the place, they would immediately disappear without a trace. It was as if there was a spy agency that was as strong and efficient as Yan Bugui's, and it was also a professional organization that was attacking Yan Bugui's subordinates in the dark. Under the observation of all the civil and military officials of the East Sea, especially the patriarchs of Great Yan's imperial clan, such as Yan Dan and Yan Bugui's face turned red, and he bowed his head embarrassedly. Like Yan Bugui, among all the civil and military officials of the East Sea, Li Si, Su Qin, Zhang Yi, and Su Fu also bowed their heads awkwardly and stared at the tips of their feet. After the 6 dynasties formed the East Sea Alliance, these 4 civil officials, who had dark and twisted characters and used cruel and vicious means, were also thrown into the spy system of the East Sea by Wu Qi. Yan Bugui was only responsible for the overall situation, while the 4 of them were each in charge of a branch. Although Yan Bugui had lost a lot of face with the severe loss of spies of the East Sea, the 4 of them, who were in charge of the specific work, did not seem to feel any better. Taking advantage of his seniority, Huang Xia laughed and said, How can we be careless when it comes to military intelligence? If, your strength is not enough, this old man can also reluctantly share the burden for you." Because of what had happened to Yu Ji and the other 2 women, Huang Xia was a little isolated. Apart from his own group of trusted subordinates, even the civil and military officials of Chu's state did not want to talk to him. Not to mention the military officials of Chu's state, each and every one of them from Xiang Yu's side was a man who dared to love and hate, and none of them liked Huang Xia, who was cold and heartless. As for the civil officials of Chu's state, with Chu Ping, a romantic and affectionate emperor, how could they have anything in common with Huang Xie? Therefore, Huang Xie had been a little irritable lately, and his words were full of sarcasm. Su Fu snorted coldly. As he narrowed his eyes and was about to argue with Huang Xia, a sonorous dragon roar suddenly came from the sky above the city in the distance. Everyone was startled, and they turned to look in that direction at the same time. They saw a 5-clawed golden dragon, its body glinting with a golden light as it flew toward them, bringing with it a large cloud. Riding on the back of the golden dragon was a middle-aged man in a purple robe. He had a jade-like complexion and an excellent bearing. 8 captains in purple armors, with only half of their faces exposed, were flying closely behind the man. The captains of the East Sea took a step forward at the same time, looking at the 8 captains with excitement and fear. 8 captains with the cultivation base of the human race in the 3rd Pangu heaven had reached the realm of primordial by practicing the cultivation technique of the human race. In the East Sea, Wu Qi had only about a dozen captains who practiced the cultivation technique of the human race, including Huang Liang. But now, there were 8 of them around this man. Ao Buzan had his arm around Immortal Jadebone's slender waist and his big hand was sneakily stroking her buttocks. When he saw the mighty golden dragon baring his fangs and brandishing his claws, he could not help but snort coldly and say, "How dare you be so presumptuous in front of Lao Tzu, my grandson?" A deep, strange howl came out of Ao Buzan's mouth. The mighty golden dragon suddenly twitched and fell from the sky like a heavy stone. Fortunately, the purple-robed man on his back reacted quickly. A cloud drifted out from under his feet and caught him firmly. On top of the city wall, Ao Buzan, Yuan Qing, and the others, who were not very kind, were laughing. Chi-Chi was laughing, and Catfish was convulsing with laughter. Almost instinctively, she showed half of her catfish head, saliva dripping from the corners of her mouth. Clearly, she was very hungry for the fallen golden dragon. The purple-robed man had been tricked by Ao Buzan, but he just smiled and flew toward them. When he was about 1,000 feet away from the city wall, he cupped his fist and bowed to Princess Zhanglu, who was surrounded by the crowd. "I am Zhang Tingyun, the Spirit Emperor. May I ask your name, my lady? Are you married?" As soon as he said that, Princess Zhang expression changed abruptly. She snorted coldly and uttered a strange incantation. Frowning slightly, Zhang Tingyun chuckled and said in a low voice, "What a hot-tempered beauty. It just so happens that there is a lack of an empress in my palace, and you are the best candidate." A strange ghost howl rang out. Suddenly, a grayish-white shadow emanating an evil aura emerged around Zhang Tingyun. The ghost had no shape, but the aura emanating from it could freeze one's blood. It was frantically tearing at Zhang Tingyun's body, and the sharp howl seemed to tear his soul to pieces. A white and flawless lotus flower, about 10 feet in circumference, slowly flew out from the top of Zhang Tingyun's head, emitting a jade-like immortal light that illuminated the surroundings. As the immortal light shone on the shadow, the ferocious ghost summoned by Princess Zhanglu let out a despairing shriek, then turned into a wisp of black smoke and drifted away. Frowning, Zhang Tingyun scolded Princess Zhanglu, "You will be the future master of the 9 palaces of the Ling dynasty, so you can't be so cruel. Come back with me now, and I'll teach you how to be the mother of the world and the holy mother of the human race." Ao Buzan burst into wild laughter. Pointing a finger at Zhang Tingyun, he said, "Where did this crazy guy come from? Who does he think he is? Brothers, he doesn't take us seriously at all. How dare he rob our man right in front of us?" Without saying a word, Lord Xianqing pulled out the illusion-breaking halberd and thrust it at Zhang Tingyun. Zhang Tingyun's face turned cold as he snorted softly. A general next to him took a step to the side and appeared in front of Zhang Tingyun. A golden round shield appeared out of thin air in front of this general. The round shield emitted a dazzling light like the sun and collided with the void-splitting halberd. A muffled thud rang out as Lord Xianqing withdrew the halberd and stood proudly. A palm-sized crack appeared in the middle of the shield, and the body of the general who blocked Lord Xianqing swayed. Suddenly, the armor near his heart cracked open, and blood sprayed out of the gap. Zhang Tingyun was startled. Suddenly, a purple slit opened between his brows, and a glinting purple vertical eye opened and gave the crowd on the wall a glance. With a shudder, the white lotus above his head suddenly emitted a dazzling light, and in the next moment, the group of people disappeared without a trace. Ling Dynasty. Princess Zhang cold voice rang out. "Assemble the army, destroy the dynasty, and slaughter the members of its imperial clan." Chapter 944. Half a year away from the border controlled by the East Sea, using the speed of ordinary golden immortals as the standard, there was a newly built city called Myriad Spirit. This was a magnificent city that even Liangzhu City paled in comparison. It was incomparably large in scale, and could only be designed by an absolute madman or a top-grade genius. Starting from the foot of the mountain, every 1 mile higher, a wide platform would be dug out from the mountain, and the city would be built on these huge platforms that were shaped like steps. The city would be built on top of these huge platforms that were hundreds of miles tall and thousands of miles in circumference. The city was densely covered with statues of dragons, phoenixes, qilins, and all kinds of spirit creatures between heaven and earth. All the buildings in the city were extremely exquisite and luxurious, and all the palaces and pavilions were made of fine gold and jade. The walls were made of fine gold, the tiles were made of fine jade, and the streets and courtyards were paved with all kinds of colorful stones. Together with the countless exotic flowers and plants in the city, the whole city looked like a huge garden. There was a large lake at the top of the mountain. It was originally a pool of clear water, but now it had turned into a lake of fine wine. The bright red wine, with a faint fragrance of grapes, flowed out of dozens of holes, and turned into dozens of waterfalls and rivers that ran through the city along the specially dug channels. Inside the city, thousands of fountains of various sizes spurted out fragrant wine or pure milk. The entire city was filled with an exotic fragrance that could captivate one's soul. None of the residents in the city were old or ugly, they were all strong young men or beautiful girls in their prime. Each of them was full of energy, and when they walked, they were accompanied by clouds. Each of them had a cultivation base of at least a high-tier heaven immortal. But, in the city, these ninth-tier heaven immortals were nothing but servants. Clad in dazzling armors of gold, purple, silver, green, blue, red, and many other colors, tall and strong warriors patrolled the city with rumbling footsteps. Tens of millions of formidable warriors were guarding the magnificent city, which was unprecedented on Pangu continent, and all enemies would be mercilessly attacked by them. The 108 supreme towers were 90% similar in shape to Dayu's, except that they had a magnificent, pure gold luster and were carved with countless patterns of dragons and phoenixes, making them as luxurious as the city of Wanling. At the top of every sky-reaching tower, there was a high priest sitting cross-legged. However, these high priests were all tall and strong. Their long white beards were meticulously groomed, and each strand was draped smoothly in front of their chests. Compared to the priests of Dayu, these priests all looked better. The priests of Dayu were like the moldy potatoes stored in the ground in winter, while these priests were like the rosy and fragrant apples on the fruit trees in autumn. At the peak of the mountain, in the center of the wine lake, a majestic palace made of translucent white jade floated quietly on the wine. A large group of beautiful girls in extremely thin clothes were frolicking on the veranda near the water. From time to time, some girls would be pushed into the wine lake by their companions, struggling to move up and down in the wine lake. Not long after, they had drunk too much wine and were all red. Then, the girls who were stomping their feet and laughing on the veranda would pick up these drunk girls, wipe them clean with white silk, and carry them to a parlor surrounded by flowers in the heart of the palace. The parlor was covered with thick, soft, and gorgeous cushions. A dozen or so drunk girls were lying on the cushions. Between their legs were mottled blood and some unknown red and white liquid. Zhang Tingyun was lying on top of a girl, his eyes blurred as he stared at a bright red rose near him, his body heaving up and down vigorously. This was the city of Wanling, this was the palace of Wanling, this was the ruling core of the Ling dynasty. The Ling dynasty was a human kingdom in outer heavenly realms that was unknown to many, but had a very strong latent power. Zhang Tingyun was the current emperor of the Ling dynasty, and only he knew how strong the Ling dynasty was. Putting everything else aside, there were more than 10,000 gold immortals worshipped by the Ling dynasty alone. These gold immortals came from more than 400 immortal sects with strong latent power in outer heavenly realms, and most of them were backed by primordial experts. The leaders of these immortal sects were the in-name disciples, outer disciples, or even personal disciples of those primordial experts. Of the 10,000 gold immortals, only 300 were allowed to enter the 9 heavens to listen to their lectures. The Ling dynasty controlled millions of outer heavenly realms, and countless people were at his mercy. Billions of mighty warriors could shatter the stars with a single order from him. Wherever his imperial edicts went, even the heavenly lords and immortal lords of the celestial court had to kneel and listen to them, trembling with fear. Only the core ministers of the celestial court who held high positions were qualified to sit on equal footing with him. Other than that, when Zhang Tingyun was born, he was born with a pure jade white lotus. This pure jade white lotus was a grand mist treasure artifact. Even though it had no offensive capabilities, its defensive capabilities were outstanding, and it was said that a single lotus could protect the body from all kinds of evil. Even the curse unleashed by Princess Zhang Lu out of anger could do nothing to Zhang Tingyun, which showed how strong the white jade lotus was. In addition, when Zhang Tingyun was a child, he was taken in as an in-name disciple by a nameless wandering Taoist. Zhang Tingyun's aptitude was excellent, and the Taoist had spent a great deal of effort to cultivate him. In just 100 years, Zhang Tingyun had stepped into the peak of the first-tier primordial immortal realm from immortal. If word of his cultivation speed were to spread, it would scare all the immortals who had been working hard for eons and were still in the realm of gold immortals. To reach the peak of the primordial immortal realm within 100 years, it was rare to see such a genius even among the human race who were known for their cultivation speed. The Taoist had even given Zhang Tingyun many defensive treasures, among which there were many powerful treasures such as chaotic spirit treasures and innate spirit artifacts. There were also treasures such as the Cosmic Natal Star Medallion, which did not have any offensive or defensive abilities, but could summon 84,000 celestial lords and extract their natal star power for his own use. With this medallion, Zhang Tingyun had once visited the Fiend realm and had an exchange with many Fiend emperors and Fiend saints. At that time, he had borrowed the natal star power of the 7 Northern Dippers celestial lords and concentrated it on himself. Together with his peak first-tier primordial immortal strength, he had defeated all the almighty experts in the Fiend realm, including those who had existed since the creation of heaven and earth. As a result, they had sent a large number of Fiend immortals to join the Ling dynasty, forming the terrifying army known as the Myriad Fiend Battalion of the Ling dynasty. Just one Cosmic Natal Star Medallion was already so powerful, not to mention the many other treasures he had. After that, everything went smoothly. Zhang Tingyun returned from the Fiend realm with glory, and his father was killed by a powerful demon during a hunting trip. Zhang Tingyun defeated many of his brothers and ascended to the throne of the Ling dynasty. On the day he ascended the throne, it rained flowers, and auspicious clouds lingered around the capital of the Ling dynasty for 3 days. The 6 great celestial emperors of the celestial court issued an edict at the same time, stating that all the immortals of the celestial court serving in the 33 heavens, except for the core ministers of the celestial court, must obey Zhang Tingyun's edict unconditionally. Compared to Zhang Tingyun, what was the so-called heaven's favored son and the love of all? In short, since Zhang Tingyun was born, everything had gone smoothly for him. There was nothing he could not get, and there was nothing he could not do. Even the dozen or so favored concubines that his late imperial father had taken in for less than 3 years, when he, Zhang Tingyun, used violence to take these favored concubines as his personal favorites, didn't all the civil and military officials praise him, Zhang Tingyun, for being unparalleled in filial piety? This time, the Ling dynasty had responded to the call of the celestial court, leading countless people and hundreds of armies to Pangu continent along with hundreds of outer heavenly realms. It only took a few months for the Ling dynasty to bring all the kingdoms of the human race that had arrived in the eastern region of Diyu under its rule. Zhang Tingyun immediately set his eyes on his neighbor in the west. It was said that an important minister of the decadent dynasty called Diyu was stationed in the western East Sea. That man seemed to be the king of East Sea. It was also said that he had some tricks up his sleeves. Today, Zhang Tingyun suddenly brought 8 of his trusted generals to a military town newly built by the Ling dynasty on the western border for a private visit. As a result, he saw Princess Xianglu standing in a military town on the East Sea 100 miles away, gazing at his city. Zhang Tingyun, who had seen countless women, was completely attracted by the mysterious, noble, and inviolable temperament of Princess Xianglu. Like a mountaineering enthusiast who had seen a brand new mountain appear in front of him, Zhang Tingyun almost instinctively wanted to dominate Princess Xianglu and completely crush her mysterious, noble, and inviolable temperament, just like all the women in the Ling dynasty who wanted anything from him. The problem was that Zhang Tingyun, who thought highly of himself, had never dreamed that Princess Xianglu would have so many experts around her, and it never occurred to him that Princess Xianglu was in existence with a cultivation base that was even more terrifying than his own. Initially, he wanted to take Princess Xianglu back to Wanling City by force, but when Princess Xianglu struck, he was shocked, for even the pure jade lotus was shaken by Princess Xiangli's curse. When Lord Xianqing struck, the people around Princess Xianglu inadvertently leaked a trace of their aura, and Zhang Tingyun immediately spun and fled. Damn it! Thinking of how he had to flee in a panic, Zhang Tingyun grabbed the neck of the girl under him and squeezed it hard. The girl's body twitched violently, and Zhang Tingyun laughed with a ferocious sneer on his face. The girl's body gradually turned cold, and a wisp of her soul slowly flew out of her body. Zhang Tingyun grinned hideously and grabbed the girl's soul in his hand, then slowly refined her soul bit by bit with a wisp of extremely thin purple flame. The mournful wails of the souls were so pleasing to his ears, so intoxicating. It was just like when he immediately killed all his brothers and brought all his sisters into the palace after he ascended to the throne. The screams, wails, and cries of pain were so intoxicating. Zhang Tingyun trembled violently. He could not control himself, and his lower body was leaking out like water, while his mind went blank. A faint purple mist rushed out from the surrounding flower beds and enveloped the parlor. The laughter of the girls around him seemed to come from another world, and he could not hear them clearly no matter how hard he tried. A strange restrictive spell had imprisoned the whole parlor. Zhang Tingyun shuddered and sprung to his feet. He glanced around in surprise, then the white jade lotus flew up with an immortal light and shielded him. Zhang Tingyun shouted sternly, "Who is so bold?" Slowly, Lu Bang walked out of the purple mist. With a smile on his face, he cupped his fist and bowed to Zhang Tingyun. "Lu Bang, the king of Han, the prime minister of the Ling dynasty, offers greetings, your majesty." As Lu Bang's laughter rang out, the expressionless crown prince of the celestial court, Lord Boyang, and Lu Bui walked slowly out of the purple mist. Zhang Tingyun was stunned to find that Lord Boyang looked exactly like him.